Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Was a Secret Sorcerer? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. In a land of myth and a time of magic, the destiny of a great kingdom rests on the shoulders of a young boy. His name is Izuku Midoriya. The young, green-haired traveler made his way down a wide woodland path. The road wasn't dangerous. Caravans and merchants used it daily, but Izuku still felt painfully aware of how unprepared he was. The woods around him were dense and full of life, every rustle stirring a new worry in his chest. Back home, forests had been something you looked out on, scarcely lining the edge of town, and only entered for very specific reasons. Here, the trees swallowed the sky, and it felt like he had entered a whole new realm. The walk itself wasn't the difficult part of his travels. His legs ached, sure, and his pack dug painfully into his shoulders, but he managed. The biggest challenge he faced on the path was the silence. Just him, his thoughts, and the distant call of the life surrounding him. The uncertainty and loneliness of it all got to him. He was leaving the town he had lived in all his life. Leaving his mother, his closest friend, and everything he recognized as safe. And now he was walking toward a future he couldn't even picture. His plan definitely wasn't foolproof, and he knew it. The only reassurance he had was the memory of his mother's insistence that he'd be safer in Mizudafu, under an old friend's care. He had never felt so blindly, stupidly lost. When the trees finally broke apart, Izuku found himself staring at stone walls rising out of the clearing like the edge of another world. Turrets stood at measured intervals, the cool gray brick contrasting against the sky. And if he squinted hard enough, he could just barely make out the silhouettes of guards pacing atop the walls. A knot of excitement entwined with fear sunk deeper in his stomach. He tightened his grip on his pack straps and quickened his steps, unable to help it. Mizudafu was enormous, legendary, and completely foreign to him. By the time he reached the city gates, his palms were sweating. He greeted the guards with a stiff attempt at confidence, and just like that, he was inside. He exhaled shakily. For a terrible moment, standing in front of those armored men, he'd felt certain they could see through him and somehow know what he was. Mizudafu's laws were very strict, and the ones about magic were no secret. Neither were their punishments. In fact, both were infamous. People spoke of their executions the way his town spoke of storm seasons, inevitable and merciless. Inside the walls, the city churned with life. Women carried baskets on their hips, men hauled sacks of grain over their shoulders, children darted between passing carts. Stalls lined the streets, selling cloth, vegetables, and various other trinkets hung up for display. The voices on the street overlapped like music. Vendors were calling out greetings and prices. Neighbors and friends walked together while gossiping. The rhythmic thud of a horse's hooves could distantly be heard somewhere deeper in the square. Izuku forgot how to walk for a moment. People had to swerve around him, shooting him confused glances as he stood frozen in the middle of the dirt road, just staring. Once he understood why people were giving him weird looks, he scrambled out of the way quickly, cheeks hot. He didn't know where to go except toward the castle. So that's what he did, weaving through the crowds and marveling like a child. The stone towers loomed taller with every step. He was nearly at the courtyard when he noticed a crowd forming. Curiosity tugged at him. Even as his feet angled automatically away to avoid trouble, his eyes stayed glued to the scene before him. The noises from the crowd was what inevitably drew him in. Izuku apologized breathlessly as he squeezed through bodies, trying to see what the crowd was looking at. When the stage came into view, his stomach dropped. Before him was a wooden platform, a cloaked man with an axe, and a boy kneeling at a block, head bowed, eyes dull with defeat. The boy's face was pressed against the human chopping block stained pink from the blood of others before him. Izuku was about to witness an execution. Above them, on the castle's balcony, the king stepped forward. The golden band on his forehead glinted against the sun. Zen looked exactly as the stories described him. He had white hair, cropped short, and eyes pale as bleached bone. His expression was unreadable as he rested his hands on the stone before him, taking a regal stance above. Before us today stands the sorcerer who used magic in the square yesterday. His voice rang out, smooth and controlled. I'm sure you all remember. Hold your children tight when monsters like these walk our streets. Muzutafu is strong because we purge the evil that threatens our peace. We look to a future of order and prosperity, and today is just another step toward that future. The crowd roared their approval. Izuku tried to push and get out, knowing he didn't want to see this, anything to get away, but the people were packed tight, a solid wall of bodies. He could barely breathe due to the inevitability of the sight before him. Below, the executioner looked up questioningly. Zen gave a small nod of approval. There was a deafening crack. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One woman screamed, shrill and heartbreakingly human. Izuku turned and spotted her. She was incredibly tiny. Her figure was dwarfed by all of those around her. Her gray hair was pulled tightly back into a neat bun, and her face was lined with grief as she surged forward. "My son," she cried. "He was my only son." Her wails cut through the silence. "You." Her head snapped to the king. "You had him killed over some silly tricks? He never hurt anyone." Her fury was aimed directly at the king. Zen didn't flinch at all. He only sneered down at the grieving woman. "You spill blood and expect none to fall back on you?" she spat. Her hands shook violently. "Your time will come soon. An eye for an eye. Not everything can be all for one." "Seize her," Zen ordered. She publicly committed treason, so this reaction could be expected. But before a single guard reached her, black dust swirled violently around her feet, swallowing her in an instant. By the time it cleared and the chaos dissipated, she was already gone. Silence clung to the air for a heartbeat. Then the crowd began to scatter, appearing somewhat shaken. Izuku couldn't move. The stage was empty now. The boy's body had already been taken somewhere he didn't dare imagine. His boots felt stuck in the dirt. Eventually, forcing himself to remember why he was here, he dragged his feet forward. He circled the courtyard, searching for the proper entrance, too rattled to think straight. He hadn't even been here a full day, and he just witnessed the death of a boy his age. He heard his mother's cries. He could already tell that this memory would be one that he'd end up blocking out. And that was when the flat of the top of his boot hit the back of his ankle. He was instantly toppling forward. He braced for impact, but a pair of hands caught him by the upper arms. Izuku caught himself with the help of the stranger behind him. He turned and was greeted by a brunette girl with soft brown eyes and flushed cheeks. She laughed lightly. "Careful. You all right?" "Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you." Izuku rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed. "It's no problem," she said, brushing some dirt off of his sleeve like a friend or a mother would. "If I'm being completely honest, you look pretty lost wandering like that." "That obvious?" he asked weakly. "Yeah, but only 'cause I was paying attention," she teased. "Where are you trying to go?" "I'm supposed to meet with the court physician and dash." Her face lit up in recognition. "Oh, yes, of course. I can take you there if you'd like." Izuku nodded gratefully. "That would be great. Thank you so much." They started toward the castle together, guards nodding in recognition as she passed. "What's your name?" she asked. "Izuku Midoriya." "And you?" "Ochako. Ochako Uraraka. I'm the head servant to Zen's ward." Then, lowering her voice a bit, "If you don't mind me asking, why are you visiting Tashinori?" Izuku fumbled for a response as they wound through hallways and started up a flight of stairs. "I'd tell you, but I genuinely don't know how to explain." "Sorry." No, don't apologize." She waved her hands in the air dismissively. "I shouldn't have asked. It isn't my business." He would have reassured her, but she stopped short. "We're here." She stood before a wooden door, rounded at its top, and engraved with small designs of plants. She pulled back on the knocker and used it shamelessly. It was loud enough to wake the dead, judging by the crash that sounded from inside. She winced. I should get back. But maybe I'll see you around?" "Yeah," Izuku said, smiling a bit. "Nice meeting you." "Same to you." She turned, her long dress and apron brushing the stone floor as she hurried off. Izuku waited a moment, hearing somebody rustling inside before he used the knocker again. "Come in," came the voice inside. Izuku swallowed hard and pushed open the door. He stepped into a room that smelled of dried rosemary, wood smoke, and something faintly metallic, kind of like the air after a storm. It was warmer than he expected and dimly lit except for a single, grand window on the far wall. Sunlight poured through it like liquid gold, catching floating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. Shelves lined nearly every wall, bowing slightly under the weight of leather-bound books. Some of them seemed so old that the titles etched into their spines had faded to soft, unreadable shades of brown. Parchment and scrolls were stacked messily in random spots around the room, tied with fraying string. Bundles of herbs hung from rafters and hooks, their leaves dry and curled, casting delicate shadows against the walls like an upside-down forest. There were jars laid around as well, some glass and some clay. They were filled with powders, seeds, roots, mostly things Izuku couldn't confidently classify. A hearth crackled quietly near the doorway, its flames small but steady. A kettle sat just at the edge of the heat, murmuring with steam. Wooden tables, too few for the clutter they bore, were layered with random items that a physician would use. On the table closest to Izuku was a mortar and pestle, multiple quills, an ink pot, scattered books, and strips of parchment scrawled in dense handwriting. A few candles, melted down nearly to their bases, sat spectating the mess. Two other doorways branched from the main chamber, one to the left, draped by a curtain rather than a door, revealing just the edges of a cot, piles of cloth, and what looked like a bedside table covered in more randomness. The other, a proper wooden door, stood closed, its iron handle tarnished with age, and the room's purpose unclear. And amidst all this controlled chaos stood the man Izuku had only ever heard stories about. Bent over a desk piled high with parchment and flickering candlelight, Toshinori Yagi, the royal court physician, and some whispered, something more. There was a rumor that he used to be a powerful knight, but the image of the man before him didn't match that picture. He looked nothing like the stories described him. No large physique or utterly blinding presence. His frame was tall but terribly thin, almost hollowed out, as though years of knowledge had carved him down to the bare essentials. His hair was a yellowish blonde, cut sharply at the base of his neck aside from longer wisps of hair that had fallen free around his face. His cheekbones were sharp, his eyes deep-set and shadowed, yet they appeared lively, attentive, and kind. He turned at the sound of the door. For a moment, Izuku felt as though Toshinori's gaze passed straight through him, not in a cold way, but as if he was searching for something deeper than what could be seen. "Ah," he said, voice worn but warm around the edges. "You must be Inko's son." He smiled then, softly and tired, but bright all the same. Suddenly, the room seemed a little less cluttered and a little less strange. Oh dear, look at this place," Toshinori spoke, turning in a slow circle as if the mess had only now revealed itself to him. "Terribly sorry. I wasn't expecting you quite this early. Had I known, I would have at least rearranged the chaos into dash." He paused, thinking for a moment about what he truly would have done, slightly more organized chaos. Though, the end of his words sounded very unsure on his tongue. Izuku stepped inside fully, closing the door softly behind him. He glanced around the chamber again, at the books stacked in precarious towers, the table buried under scribbled notes, and the herbs drooping from the rafters like sleepy bats. He had the distinct feeling that this room always looked like this, regardless of who was coming or when. "Sorry, sir, but I'm pretty sure I'm actually right on time," Izuku said, clearing his throat. Toshinori paused, both eyebrows lifting. "On time?" Izuku nodded with his hands clasped behind his back. For a second, Toshinori just looked at him, blinking once, then twice, before a gentle, slightly embarrassed chuckle escaped him. "Well then, it seems I owe you a second apology. I tend to lose track of time when I work. Not the hours so much as the days." Izuku relaxed a little. Something eased in his chest. Toshinori didn't feel like the rest of the city. He didn't feel like stone walls and strict lawfulness. He felt very human. His warmth was almost familiar. Well, Toshinori continued, smile settling into something softer, it seems you're where you're supposed to be now. Izuku knew he probably didn't intend for the words to hold such meaning, but they did. Toshinori's face twisted slightly in thought, as if recalling an old memory. He passed from behind the table over to a set of drawers across the room. He hunched over, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a piece of paper. He stood still, reading it over. The only thing that filled the silence was the soft crackles of the fire. Finally, he turned and offered the letter to Izuku. His chest tightened the moment he saw the familiar handwriting. He read, "Dear friend, I know you have already done much for my family, but I must ask for yet another favor. My son, Izuku, is in danger. He must leave town soon. His abilities are beyond my knowledge, but not beyond yours. I want to help, but I think if I tried any more, I'd be out of my depth. You are the only one I can trust with this. Please, Yagi, I beg of you. All I ask is for my son to be safe. Sincerely, Inko Midoriya." Izuku lingered on the last line longer than he meant to. Seeing her name in ink made something settle quietly in his chest. It was a sense of comfort, safety, and a tinge of sadness. But a question followed. How did his mother know Toshinori Yagi in the first place? And what did all of this mean? She had always avoided talking about her past, or really about anything before she gave birth to Izuku. His dad was a sensitive subject. "I assume you saw the letter I sent back," Toshinori said, tone gentle. "Given that you are here now." Izuku nodded, eyes still on the paper. "One more question, young Midoriya." Izuku looked up and instinctually braced himself. Toshinori's expression turned serious in an instant. It was almost frightening. "Do you have magic?" He hesitated. His fingers tightened around the paper, knuckles whitening. His mother trusted this man. That much was clear. But it didn't make saying it much easier. "Yes, sir," he muttered in a small voice. He took a deep breath before speaking more firmly, "I do." Toshinori only laughed. Izuku's heart shot into his throat. Had he said too much? Was this a setup? Was he the next boy on the chopping block? "There is no need to call me, sir," Toshinori said gently, interrupting his panic before it could grow. "You are a Midoriya. Please call me Yagi." Izuku let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Toshinori smiled, then rested his elbows on his knees slightly, studying him with a thoughtful look. "Tell me, then, how did your magic begin? Who taught you?" Izuku hesitated once more. "No one. I never learned it. It's just always been there. It doesn't feel like something I do. It feels more like something I am." He spoke before processing the words spilling from his mouth in freefall. Toshinori's brows lifted ever so slightly. "Interesting," he murmured. "That kind of magic is very rare. I've only ever met one other like you." He paused, and for a moment, something sorrowful flickered through his eyes. Magic flows through everything and everyone, but it is sometimes naturally stronger in some. Many believed it was a purposeful choice of fate. If you had been born 100 years earlier, your gift would have been celebrated, cherished. He shook his head. "But now, well, obviously you know that's no longer true." Izuku looked down. "I don't think mine could ever be celebrated," he admitted sorrowfully. "And why is that?" Toshinori ped his head ever so slightly. "My magic feels more like breathing to me than a controlled power. Sometimes I forget I should be holding my breath or I run out of air, and it just spills out." He sat down idly on a nearby bench, drawing a knee to his chest. "That's why I had to leave my village. It was becoming more and more obvious that I was the cause of some of the incidents they excused as freak accidents of nature." Toshinori's eyes widened, not with fear, but thoughtful intrigue. He seemed to consider that deeply. "Well," Toshinori said at last, a warm smile forming. "Then I'll teach you to control it. How would you like that?" Izuku practically lit up. No, literally. His posture corrected itself at the idea, the light from the window hitting the back of his green curls and haloing him. "Yes." He realized how excitedly childlike he appeared and he calmed himself externally. "Yes, I'd love that. Thank you, sir. Sorry. I mean Yagi. Come with me." Toshinori beckoned him. Toshinori traveled to the door across from the entrance. with Izuku in tow, and opened it with a creak. Inside was a small, dust-coated room, sparsely furnished with a narrow cot, neatly folded sheets, and a few crates of medical and herbal supplies stacked against one wall. To the right stood a modest bookshelf, half empty, its contents a mix of old texts and loose parchment. A single bedside table sat beside the cot, the wood worn soft with age. Toshinori stepped over to it. He opened the drawer, reached inside, and pulled out a small journal bound shut with twine. With careful fingers, he untied the string and gave the book a gentle shake. A metal key slipped out and clinked against the wooden floor. He knelt, picked it up, then straightened, stepping off the small rug beneath his feet. Gripping the edge of the rug, he pulled it aside to reveal a wooden trapdoor. He inserted the key and twisted it with a soft click. He lifted the trapdoor and reached into the dark compartment below, rummaging around briefly before pulling a weathered book from its depths. He brushed away the dust on the cover with his palm, revealing intricate designs carved into it. The swirling patterns and symbols on the leather were engraved with care. A golden-appearing clasp held it shut for what seemed like years. Izuku figured that may be an accurate assumption. Time had worn the edges, but the book still held a quiet kind of dignity. Toshinori turned to Izuku and held out the book for him to take. "This was my old grimoire," he said, his voice softer now. "It helped me through a lot when magic was still relevant." He sighed audibly, eyebrows slightly creased. Izuku took the book gently. He opened the clasp and flipped through the pages, eyes widening. Inside were detailed diagrams, runes, spells, and sketches of creatures he had never seen before. All of the descriptions were drawn with elegant, precise handwriting. In the margins, smaller, scrappier notes crowded the edges. He assumed they belonged to Toshinori. Izuku ran his fingers across an illustration, almost reverently. "Thank you so much," he whispered. "I've never seen anything like this." He looked up from the yellowed pages. "I know. It's truly unfortunate," Toshinori said with a frown. He was distracted by his own thoughts. "Have you eaten?" Izuku opened his mouth but was cut off. "Of course you haven't. Let me make you something." He moved to the hearth, rolling up his sleeves. It wasn't elegant cooking, but Izuku liked it that way. It made the space feel more like a home. Steam curled in the air, carrying a mouth-watering smell with it. Toshinori hummed under his breath while stirring, mumbling occasionally about needing more dried fennel, ginger root, and a proper stock of king's root. "I'll have to go to the square tomorrow for peas," he muttered. Izuku nodded absently, taking a mental note. They ate at the small oak table by the window, the one least cluttered with random items. Conversation drifted into quiet, easy territory. They mostly spoke of Izuku's travels. He described the new experiences he had and how Mizutafu looked from a distance, like stone teeth jutting into the sky. Toshinori listened patiently with a smile, asking the occasional question. After dinner, he led Izuku again to the small back room. "It's a bit neglected," he admitted, pulling the door open. "We'll clean it up sometime soon," Toshinori added, "I promise. Now, get some sleep." Izuku thanked him again before retiring. He closed the door, set a candle on the table, and opened the grimoire again. He didn't mean to fall asleep that way, sitting up with his head leaning against the wall, and the book resting open in his lap. "Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Izuku." A woman's voice called. He jolted upright, eyes darting across the small room, but nothing was there. Moonlight spilled through the window, painting the stone floor in different blue hues. His heart thundered in his chest. Must have been dreaming. He closed the book and set it aside carefully, tracing a corner of the cover with his thumb. He sighed and rubbed his hands across his face. Izuku figured he must just be hearing things and laid down on his side, but the moment he shut his eyes, he heard again. "Izuku Midoriya." The voice returned. He bolted upright again. Now on edge, he slipped his shoes on and left his room, checking Toshinori's entire place from top to bottom, careful not to wake the sleeping man behind the curtained-off area. At one point he found something that might have been a lizard's tail or a shriveled root. He didn't investigate any further, scrunching his nose up at some of the ingredients and items. his search was completely fruitless. Eventually, he returned to the room, defeated and unsettled. He laid down again, but every time sleep dared to start dragging him under, he'd hear it again. He wrapped his pillow around his ears. It made no difference. He grit his teeth and sat up, defeated, laying his head against his knees with a groan. In the end, he barely got any sleep. But he did decide to at least be productive while he was awake, reading the grimoire he already adored. He was still up for sunrise, riding on about 2 hours of sleep at best. By dawn, he had given up entirely. He sat cross-legged on the floor, reading again, letting the morning light spread slowly across the pages. The sunrise felt like a gentle promise, and it motivated Izuku to get up. He put on his worn white shirt, green vest, and rundown boots. He swung his satchel over his shoulder and, remembering the names of the skis Toshinori had listed the day before, quietly slipped out. He made a wrong turn leaving, but eventually he found the right way. It only made sense for him to get lost in a huge castle he'd only ever entered once before. After exiting the castle, Izuku started to make his way to the market on a mission. He allowed himself to smile genuinely. The outside air filled him with hope. Maybe this fresh start had promise, despite the horror he had seen. It was already fading from his memory after Izuku willed it away. The sound of wood splintering followed by laughter pulled him out of his thoughts. Izuku paused, looking toward the training grounds of the castle. A small crowd had gathered near the sounds. He moved closer, never learning his lesson about curiosity in cats. A short boy younger than Izuku held a brightly colored wooden target, arms shaking under its weight. He was wearing a helmet far too big for his face. It jostled on his head with any movement, truly a comical sight to everyone else around except Izuku. "Faster!" A knight barked, laughing. The boy started to object. "Come on guys, I'm really tired and dash." An axe whirled through the air. It hit dead center on the piece of wood with a sickening crack. The boy flinched and scrambled to start running. A knight strode forward and yanked the axe free in one fluid, practiced motion. Izuku's eyes backtracked, following the path that the axe took through the air, quickly locating the arm that threw it. His eyes were the first thing that Izuku noticed, the most striking red he's ever seen. His blonde hair was more of an ash color than yellow, unlike Toshinori's. If it caught the right angle in the sunlight, the knight's hair nearly looked white like fine silk threads. He was broad-shouldered and clearly muscular beneath his armor. He wore chainmail, mostly hidden beneath a deep red surcoat bearing the crest of Mizudafu. Over that, a single piece of plate armor curved from his right bicep across his chest and up toward the left side of his neck. He didn't watch where his weapon landed or how the others reacted. He didn't need to. Instead, he held his hand out for another axe. Izuku couldn't look away. The blonde's fingers flexed around the leather grip as soon as it landed against his palm. The short boy with the target was still running, panting, and stumbling through the dirt as laughter chased him as relentlessly as the axes. "Come on, great boy, keep running. Just don't get hit," one of the knights cackled. The blonde knight from before stepped forward, drawing back his arm with what Izuku assumed was perfect form. It commanded the space around him, every motion appearing intentional and precise. But as he prepared to throw again, Izuku moved before he could think. His hand closed gently, but firmly, around the knight's forearm. The blonde's head snapped to the side, brows lowering, confusion beginning to turn to a threatening gaze. Red eyes met green. For a moment, everything stilled. Izuku's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his expression soft and polite. He cleared his throat, wearing a smile that felt too tight around the edges. "Come on, that's enough. You've had your fun, my friend." He meant it lightly. The smile on his face was an offering of his good graces. The knight blinked slowly, then scoffed. "Do I know you?" His voice was gravelly, and despite his raw tone, his words sounded almost elegantly spoken. Izuku stepped back, extending his hand to introduce himself. I'm Izuku Dash." "So I don't know you," the knight interrupted, already unimpressed. "No. Yet you called me friend." There was a pause. Izuku thinned his lips, stifling his frustrations where they lay on his tongue. "That was my mistake." The knight gave a mocking nod. Yes, I think so. He turned away, the other knights already laughing, encouraged by his cruelty. Izuku exhaled, something sour curling in his chest. He had tried to be kind, really he had. Yeah, he said lightly, with a pleasant smile and eyes that weren't smiling at all. I've never had a friend who could be such an but. It was so casually spoken it almost sounded polite. He turned and began to walk away, but a voice followed, low, amused and dangerous. And I've never had one that could be so stupid. Izuku froze, turning back as the blonde menace of a knight stepped forward with slow, unhurried confidence. Tell me, Izuku, he drawled, stretching the name between his teeth like a threat, do you know how to walk on your knees? Nope. Would you like me to help you? He didn't look serious. That made it worse. He was a joke to the other boy. Izuku took a step back. I wouldn't if I were you. The knight tilted his head, smirk growing sharper. But what are you gonna do to me? You have no idea, Izuku murmured, steadying his voice, letting a smile ghost his lips. Red eyes gleamed. Then be my guest. He spread his arms slightly in invitation, daring him to strike. Izuku stood perfectly still. Come on, the blonde taunted, eyes burning. Hit me. Show me what you can do, tough guy. Izuku didn't move. Well, he said, tipping his head as though reconsidering, if you aren't gonna do it, dash. Izuku swung. Or he tried to. His arm was caught midair and twisted behind his back in a blur of motion too quick to track. Pain shot up into his shoulder, and Izuku hissed despite himself. The blonde leaned in, voice low beside his ear. You know you're going to jail for that? He could hear the smile in his voice. Izuku grit his teeth. Who do you think you are, the king? No, his answer was immediate. I'm his son, he growled, tightening his grip. There was a beat of silence as the words sunk in. He finished his sentence with finality. Katsuki. Izuku paled, just as the prince shoved him forward, his arms still wrenched uncomfortably behind his back. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Izuku had never been jailed before. Least to say, it wasn't fun. It was less dramatic than he'd imagined. He faced more boredom than regret. Most of his time was spent staring out the small window in his cell that he could barely pop his fingers out of. Tashinori had heard of what happened and he was down in front of Izuku's cell immediately. He paced in front of the bars separating them while scolding him mercilessly. It was brutal. He hadn't known Tashinori for very long, yet the worst part of the experience had been the older's disappointment. He managed to shorten Izuku's sentence from a week to only a few days, muttering something about Izuku being a problem child. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Now, outside at the stocks, Izuku felt an ache in his neck and back from being bent over with his arms and head locked in place. Occasionally, someone would throw fruit at him, and small children would stop to giggle like he was their new favorite attraction. Humbling was an understatement. After all, how could he even dare to speak of the prince after humiliation like this? While he was busy staring dramatically at the dirt, a pale pink skirt appeared in his line of vision. He blinked. Hey, Izuku, right? He shifted as much as the wood allowed, which wasn't much. Nyah. It was the maid from before. Her smile was warm, sympathetic, and a little amused. I just wanted to say that I saw what you did. It was really brave of you. It was stupid, Izuku said flatly. Well, yes, she admitted, laughing a little too brightly. I mean, you're lucky he ended the fight quickly. Izuku's eyebrows shot up. What? I could beat him. Ochako gave him an odd, constipated look. You sure? She teased, raising a brow. You don't look like one of those big muscle Y types. She stifled a giggle. It wasn't hard to see. Izuku stared at her, affronted, lips tight. Thanks, he muttered sarcastically. Oh my God, no. I didn't mean it like that, she squeaked, flailing her hands around frantically. I'm sure you're stronger than you look. Izuku took a deep breath to ground himself at the unintentionally backhanded compliment. She softened and appeared more sincere now. It's just, Katsuki is one of those rough, tough, save-the-world kind of men. You don't look like that. I'm in disguise, don't worry. Izuku smiled faintly. Ochako laughed, covering her mouth. She moved her hand away before continuing, I meant it, though. It was great that somebody stood up to him. You think so? She nodded. Katsuki is a bully. Everybody thought you were a real hero. Well, at least heroish. Her hand rotated side to side at the wrist. Izuku smiled, the interaction a small comfort. Just then, a squadron of very determined children marched over, armed with a different assortment of things to assault the green-haired boy with. By the end of this, his hair would definitely be less green, or maybe more. Izuku sighed dramatically. Oh, excuse me, Ochako. My fans are here. He smiled charmingly, then immediately flinched as a tomato met the wood right beside his head. I should probably go, she said, wincing as a piece of cabbage flew past her. Izuku nodded. Yeah dash. Another piece of vegetable narrowly missed the maid. Ochako yelped, dodging as she hurried past. Good luck. She called over her shoulder with a laugh. Diamond operator. Star operator, diamond operator. Izuku was released from the stocks near sunset, when the sky was smeared with fading gold. He rubbed at his sore shoulders and neck, muscles stiff from being stuffed in the stocks all afternoon. His hair still carried sticky traces of fruit that clung like embarrassing souvenirs of the public humiliation he had faced. He grimaced at the strands of hair that stuck to his face like glue. The corridor back to the physician's quarters was oddly quiet. The stone walls glowed warm under torchlight. Izuku was grateful for this short moment of peace. His boots scuffed against the worn floor, echoing softly in the silence of the hall. By the time he pushed open the door, he could barely suppress a sigh of exhaustion. The familiar scent of herbs, smoke, and something vaguely medicinal welcomed him. The room looked even cozier than usual in the lamplight. Toshinori stood at the small table, ladling stew into a bowl already set with a torn hunk of bread to the side. Ah, you're finally back, he said, his voice sounding a bit stiff. His irritation was clear after he made an obvious jab. Would you like some vegetables with your soup? Izuku winced dramatically at the word. He didn't have to himself to see his reflection to know he definitely looked gross. He slumped into his chair, pulling his bowl toward him from across the table. I know you're still mad at me, he muttered, staring down at his food like it had personally offended him. Toshinori gave a long sigh and sat across from him. The lamplight made the wrinkles around his tired eyes seem deeper, but kind. Your mother asked me to look after you, young Midoriya. Izuku stirred his soup absent-mindedly, cheeks smushed against his palm. The spoon made quiet laps around the bowl. Toshinori waited a moment, then shifting some of his weight to his forearms, he spoke, tone softer. What did she have to say about your gifts? Izuku froze mid-stir. Slowly, he straightened, shoulders squaring instinctively. She said that I was special. He felt heat rise to his cheeks as he realized how childish that made him sound. Toshinori smiled faintly, eyes distant but warm. Well, from what I've heard so far, I'd have to agree. Izuku blinked. What do you mean? Toshinori folded his hands before him. Well, magic requires incantations, spells, and a lot of intention. It takes years to study. You say you haven't studied at all, and that it's purely instinctual. Izuku paused, absorbing this. Did you ever study magic? A small, sad smile flickered over Toshinori's face. Zen banned such work over 20 years ago. Izuku frowned, spoon knocking faintly against the bowl. Why would he do that? I don't understand. People used magic for the wrong reasons, Toshinori said quietly. It threw the natural order into chaos. The king made it his mission to destroy all such things from then, including sorcerers and creatures born from it, even dragons. All dragons? I'd heard stories, but I didn't think it was true. Well, Toshinori hummed, leaning back. All but one. Or so they say. His voice lowered, softer, like telling an old secret. He keeps that one imprisoned. Deep beneath the castle. Where none can find it. He waved a dismissive hand. Might be nothing more than a dusty legend. I'm getting older. I'm not the strong knight I once was. Izuku stared quietly into the flickering firelight, his mind somewhere far below the stone floors of the castle. A beat passed. Then Toshinori clapped his hands once. Anyway, finish your food and wash off. I need you to deliver a preparation to Lady Nemuri's chambers. Izuku shoveled a spoonful of soup into his mouth. What's it for? He asked, cheeks full. Her voice, Toshinori smiled. She's singing for the upcoming banquet. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Izuku tossed the small glass vial between his hands as he walked down the dim corridor, humming to himself just to fill the silence. Lady Nemuri's chamber was at the far end of the hall. Her door was pretty isolated from the others. He knocked lightly. Lady Nemuri? He called. There was no response. He waited, knocked again, and then called a little louder. Still nothing. He hesitated, then gently pushed the door open. Inside, the room was still and faintly perfumed, lavender and patchouli. Light filtered through gauzy curtains, casting long pale strips across the floorboards. He stepped in slowly, placing the yellowish liquid on a vanity table positioned oddly at the center of the room. It was grand with silver detailing. It seemed fitting for a beautiful singer, but the mirror was half covered by a draped sheet. It was strange, like someone had hidden it for other reasons instead of protecting it from dust. Izuku told himself it didn't matter. He turned to leave, but something on the desk caught his eye. A small straw doll. Its limbs were stiff and bound to create shape. The straw was fraying on certain ends and looked almost hastily made. Why would Lady Nemuri have something like this? The moment his fingers brushed against it, a strange tightness coiled low in his stomach, an instinctive but irrational discomfort, like he just touched something alive. He exhaled slowly. It's just a doll, Izuku. Still, he set it down more gently than he'd picked it up. Next to it was a book tucked beneath a folded sleeve of velvet fabric, bound together with knotted string. The symbols engraved in the cover looked eerily similar to the ones on Toshinori's grimoire. Izuku's pulse jumped. The leather was worn and darkened with age. It was definitely very loved by whoever it belonged to. He turned it over in his hands, tracing the rough binding. He shouldn't open it. He knew that. His fingers worked at the string anyway. But before he could loosen it, he heard footsteps down the hall. It was distinctly the sound of heels clicking against stone and drawing closer. Izuku froze. He quickly set the book back, fixing everything to look just as he'd found it. He turned away from the vanity just as the door creaked open. There, silhouetted in the doorway, stood a tall woman with sleek black hair curling over one shoulder, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing in here?" she sneered, voice devoid of any possible warmth. Izuku opened his mouth, but instead turned to reach for the vial, only to catch, in the reflection of the half of the mirror that lay uncovered, a different woman than the one had just seen before him. Instead, she was short with gray hair and watching him with beady eyes. But when he turned back, only the black-haired woman remained. His breath caught in his chest. He held out the vial, forcing himself to inhale. "The royal physician instructed me to deliver this for your performance," he said, forcing a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good luck, by the way." She took it slowly, gaze lingering on him for just a second too long. Izuku hurried out of the room, arms glued to his sides. The second he stepped into the corridor, his heartbeat finally caught up to him, thudding loud and uneven in his ears. Was his mind playing tricks on him again? The voice from his first night in Mizudafu continued to occasionally speak his name, but it lessened enough that he could sleep. But the sinking feeling in his stomach didn't feel imagined. It felt like a warning. Could this be just another illusion, or was the reeling in his gut telling the truth? Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. The sun beat against the back of Izuku's neck as he strolled through the village, keeping to himself after splitting up with Toshinori. He did his best to navigate through the chaos, still not fully accustomed to the contrasting environment to his small hometown. He kept his head down, focusing on making his way through the chaos, until the unmistakable clank of armor and boisterous laughter cut through the noise. A small entourage of knights walked down the road going the opposite direction of Izuku, and in the center of them, stealing all the attention, the prince. Izuku picked up his pace, fixing his gaze on his boots. Maybe if he walked fast enough, they wouldn't notice him. Or more specifically, the one knight he least wanted to see wouldn't. He was wrong. Katsuki Bakugo veered off course, right into Izuku's path, boots kicking dust as he smirked in that infuriatingly smug way of his. "How's your knee walking coming along?" he called, voice dripping with arrogance. Izuku didn't break stride, walking past as if the man wasn't the prince himself. "Oh, don't run away," Katsuki teased loudly, his knights chuckling behind him. "From you?" Izuku scoffed without looking back. Katsuki's grin widened. "Thank God. I thought you were deaf as well as dumb." Izuku stopped, turned, and very plainly said, "Look, I already told you that you're an a-hole. I just didn't know you were a royal one." Toshinori was going to kill him. Katsuki turned to the other knights who just stared forward in shock, in disbelief that someone would dare to speak this way to royalty. "Oh no, what are you going to do? You got your daddy's men to protect you?" The prince barked out a genuine laugh. "I could take you apart with one blow." "I could take you apart with less than that," Izuku challenged. His brain couldn't keep up with the words that were spilling from his mouth. There was a high chance he'd be in the stocks tomorrow, but his sense of justice overpowered his rationality. "You sure?" Katsuki smiled. Izuku shrugged off his satchel and coat, tossing them aside like he actually knew what he was doing. Katsuki and the knights laughed to each other, utterly astounded at the smaller boy's bravery. Katsuki whistled. "You're serious?" He chuckled. "I thought maybe you'd learned your lesson the first time. Guess I'll have to show you your place again." The prince casually tossed him a training mace. Izuku flinched back instead of catching the ball and chain weapon, causing Katsuki and his knights to snort. Katsuki stepped forward, spinning his own respective weapon effortlessly. The chain glinted dangerously in the sun. "I'll warn you. I've been trained to kill since birth." "Oh really?" Izuku deadpanned. "And how long have you been training to be an asswipe?" "Asswipe?" Katsuki let out an incredulous laugh. "Who the F even says that?" He shook his head, still grinning. "You know, you can't address me like Dash." "Sorry," Izuku interrupted, bending into an exaggerated bow. "How long have you been training to be an asswipe, my lord?" Katsuki turned as if to laugh yet again with his friends before suddenly whirling back, slinging his weapon directly at Izuku's head. He ducked and started backing down the street with speed. "Come on then, Izuku," Katsuki called, sounding half furious and half thrilled. He stalked behind Izuku like a wolf. They tore down the street past merchants yelling, villagers scrambling to get out of the way, and carts hardly stopping in time. Izuku dodged between stalls, breathless, clutching the stupid chain weapon. The end caught a hanging potted plant, jerking him backward. "Sorry," he apologized to the shopkeeper, wrestling it free as leaves and petals rained down. Katsuki didn't slow. He knew these streets, till he owned them. Izuku spun around a fruit stall, expecting to be able to catch his breath for at least a moment, only to nearly collide with Katsuki. The prince swung wide, his weapon crushing a plum that burst beside Izuku in a purple explosion. Izuku's back hit hard against a fruit cart, legs flipping over it, then somehow, he landed on his knees, popping back up just in time to see Katsuki vault clear over the cart like it was nothing. "You've got to be kidding," Izuku muttered before taking off again. He didn't get far. Izuku stumbled to the ground atop a pile of large bags golf grain, leaning back on his forearms. "Looks like you're in trouble now, Freckles," Katsuki smiled, pleased to be the winning predator in their game of cat and mouse. He swung his weapon back, ready to strike. Izuku's gaze darted around for some way out. Magic seemed like his only option, but he didn't exactly summon it. It was a guttural reaction. Izuku's eyes glowed golden, an involuntary physical reaction his body had when he used his power. The sides hanging from a nearby farm display rattled, then swung down with a metallic shriek, tangling around Katsuki's chain weapon like living vines. Gasps erupted from the watching crowd. It was truly no fault of the prince's, but to the onlooking crowd, and even Katsuki himself, it certainly looked that way. He pulled his weapon free before turning back to face the source of his anger with a snarl. Izuku scrambled to his feet, backing into a narrow alley. Katsuki followed, steps faster and louder now. Izuku's eyes flickered gold yet again. A crate slid just enough to the side at a perfect angle. Katsuki stepped into the inside of it, and it slammed into his shin. F-dash! He yanked his leg back, kicking the empty crate with force. Izuku, now grinning wildly, made a taunt at him, motioning with his hands for the prince to come forward. "Come on, then, your highness," he drawled. Katsuki charged forward with his weapon raised. Izuku's eyes glowed again, and the prince happened to trip over a rope perfectly at ankle level. Katsuki hit the dirt with a very undignified thud. Izuku swung his own weapon. Katsuki rolled out of the way, dirt smearing across the red of his surcoat. "Do you yield, my lord?" Izuku teased, standing over him. "Midoriya!" Toshinori's furious voice exploded from down the lane. He was holding his bag and coat, and his face was painted with disappointment and frustration. Izuku looked back. The reason he was here in the first place was to help his mentor shop. They had only briefly parted ways. Of course Izuku had to go and find trouble. But he made a mistake letting this distract him. Izuku immediately found himself flat on the ground, courtesy of the prince. The moment he looked away, Katsuki got to his knee, grabbed a nearby broom, knocked Izuku's feet out from under him, and whacked him with the end of it. Izuku yelped more in surprise than pain, though his shoulder blade sure throbbed from the fall. Katsuki made a show of his win as he swept right beside Izuku, blowing dirt into the other boy's face. He sputtered, moving his arm back and forth to clear the dust away from his eyes and mouth. The smaller boy was instantly swarmed by knights who grabbed him by the arms, pulling him up. They weren't easy on him either, wrenching his biceps behind his back. He grit his teeth. "Wait," Katsuki called out, breathless. Izuku looked up at him, utterly shocked. The prince stepped forward, eyes still wild with leftover adrenaline, frustration, and something else unreadable. "He may still be an idiot," he said, gaze locked on Izuku, "but he's a brave one." He tilted his head, leaning just slightly toward Izuku. "There's something about you, Izuku. I just can't quite put my finger on it." He turned and started to walk past, not even bothering to look behind. "Let him go. Diamond operators, star operators, star operator, diamond operator." Izuku may not be scheduled to be in the stocks tomorrow, but he didn't get off fully scot-free. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, Toshinori's voice cracked through the room like thunder. "How could you be so foolish?" Izuku had expected this reaction. He was already halfway across the room, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on anything but Toshinori. He needed to be taught a lesson, he muttered, trying to sound firm in his resolve. Toshinori stepped forward, robes dragging across the floorboards with purpose. His eyes, usually warm and tired, looked sharp for once. "Magic must be studied, mastered, and used for good, not for your childish theatrics." Izuku whirled around, frustration bursting through. "What is there to master?" His voice was hoarse. "I could move objects like that before I could read." He gestured wildly to the air as if it could give testimony on his behalf. "Then by now," Toshinori snapped, "you should know how to control yourself." "I don't want to." Izuku's voice cracked. "I don't want to control it." His breath hitched, and the anger drained from his posture, leaving something smaller behind. "If I can't use magic, what do I have?" His fists curled at his sides, knuckles whitening. "I'm just nothing then." He blinked fast. "And I always will be. If I can't use magic, I might as well just disappear completely." He didn't mean the last bit that he muttered, but it came out anyways. "It wouldn't matter if I did anyways." Silence settled into the room, heavy and uncomfortable. Izuku turned away and shoved open his bedroom door. He slammed it behind him with a crack. There was a short pause before the door cautiously opened again. "Sorry," Izuku quietly apologized, a little bit of his normal self reappearing. "I didn't mean to shut the door that hard." He closed it again, almost delicately this time. Toshinori let out a long, tired sigh, wiping his hands over his face. "Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator." Izuku was given some time to cool off by himself, though it didn't really do much for his mental state. He was face down on his bed with his hands hanging limply off the sides. His face was pressed into the pillow, making it difficult to breathe. He endured it, however, due to his stubborn nature. The door creaked open without so much as a knock. Tashinori stepped in, carrying a wooden bucket, a folded cloth, and a small bottle. "Come now," he said softly. "Sit up. I'm sure you have injuries." Izuku groaned, rolling over slowly. He peeled off his shirt without a word, revealing a wide patch of irritated skin across the right side of his upper back from when he'd been knocked to the ground. Tashinori sat beside him on the bed, wetting the cloth he had brought with a quiet focus. He began to clean the minimal wound gently. Izuku stared at the wall. "You don't know why I was born like this, do you?" Tashinori didn't pause his motions, but his expression tightened. "No. I'm not a monster, am I?" This time, Tashinori did stop. He pulled away and laid the cloth down on the edge of the bucket sitting on Izuku's nightstand. He looked Izuku directly in the eyes with a steady gaze. "Don't ever think that, young Midoriya." Izuku's throat bobbed. His voice was unsteady. "Then why am I like this? Please, I need to know why, Yagi." "Maybe," Tashinori said slowly, "there's someone with more knowledge than me." Izuku's shoulders sank. He stared at his hands as if they might reveal some sort of answers to him. "If you can't tell me," he said hopelessly, "I don't know that anyone can." He slumped forward, emotional exhaustion pouring from him like spilled ink. Tashinori pursed his lips, not knowing how to respond. Instead he diverted his attention to something else. He picked up a small vial of cloudy liquid. "Here," he murmured, placing it in Izuku's palm. "Drink this. It will help with the pain." Izuku took the bottle, uncorked it, and downed it in one go. His whole expression twisted. "That is not good." Tashinori huffed softly, something between a sigh and a laugh. "Trust me, it could be a lot worse." He patted Izuku's leg, gathered the bucket and cloth, and stood. He lingered a second longer in the doorway, like he wanted to say something else, but he never did. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. That night, Izuku lay stiffly in bed, arms crossed tight over his chest, eyes pinned to the ceiling's dark beams. He wasn't even pretending to sleep. His thoughts had gone strangely quiet, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Izuku." The voice was back. "Izuku," she called again. He sat up in bed with a sigh, but something about this time was different. Izuku took a second to truly evaluate his feelings. He could feel a pull in his gut, drawing him away, further into the castle. Without questioning, he slipped out from his bed, tugging on his boots and coat, an odd sense of purpose blooming inside the hollow parts of him. The curiosity and determination he felt placated the feeling of meaninglessness in Izuku for the time being. He opened his door and stepped softly into the main room. Tashinori was asleep behind the sheer curtain separating his room from the rest of the place, snoring loudly. Izuku passed quietly, but in his hurry, his hip brushed a small wooden box, sending it clattering to the floor. The snoring was replaced by silence and Izuku's heart sank. Then as quickly as the noise stopped, it started again. He exhaled shakily and brought a hand to his chest in relief. He knelt to pick up the fallen box. After collecting the contents and placing it back on the table, he stepped toward the curtain. He hesitated before drawing it back. Izuku looked softly at the old man curled on his side. He shuddered in his sleep. Izuku didn't trust himself to tuck Tashinori in without waking him. Instead, he raised his hand and his eyes turned faintly from green to gold. The blanket beside Tashinori floated up, falling gently around the sleeping man's shoulders. A small smile tugged at Izuku's lips. He pulled the curtain back and exited the room, careful not to knock into anything this time. "Izuku." The voice continued to call him, and each time, the pull that came with it only grew stronger. He found himself going further and further down into stairways that he never even knew existed until now. His feet were moving mindlessly, following his motive. He rounded a bend, not bothering to keep quiet, when he suddenly froze. Two guards sat at an oak table near the base of the staircase he was descending, playing dice. Their laughter echoed against the stone walls. Luckily, he heard them before they could hear him. One of the men cupped his hands together and shook, rattling the dice. Izuku's eyes turned gold, and when the guard let go, the dice shot clean off the table and skittered to the ground, disproportionately to his throw. Both guards looked to each other, to the dice, and then back to each other. One stood to retrieve their only game. Izuku's eyes became gold once again. The guard yelped, tripping over absolutely nothing, kicking the dice into one of two shadowed hallways. The other guard, not flat on his butt, stood with a sigh. "You're useless." He helped his friend up and they went into the hallway together to retrieve the cubes. Izuku quickly snatched a lit torch from the wall and slipped silently through the opposite corridor. He turned down the hall and was led to yet another staircase. There was no hesitation in his movement now, only momentum. Izuku. This staircase was longer than the rest, and so steep, Izuku swore he felt his ears pop. He reached the bottom of the final flight and turned the corner expecting a hallway or maybe even more stairs. Instead he was met with a cavern. An immense underground expanse stretched before him, larger than the castle itself. Huge stalactites protruded from the ground and ceiling like teeth, only complicating the place more. Izuku was standing on a small cliff with a steep descent of stairs carved out of the stone far, far down into the caves. He was about to test if it was a safe idea to use them when he heard the voice again. However, instead of calling his name, it was laughing. This time, the voice wasn't echoing in his head. It was echoing in the cave. He raised the torch he held slowly, but it didn't reveal anything until something finally moved. A shape peeled itself from the shadows, large and alive. A dragon stepped onto a formation of stone not far from Izuku. Her yellow claws clicked against the stone. "I'm here," she spoke. She was enormous, beautiful, and pitch black with scales that flickered red and gold when she shifted. Her wings, white on the inside, unfolded with a sound that shook the floor. Izuku stumbled back, speechless. "How small you are," she said, her voice calm and ancient, "for such a great destiny." Izuku's voice barely worked, but he projected into the darkness nonetheless. "What destiny?" "Your gift, Izuku, was given to you for a reason." Hope swallowed his expression. His heart might as well be soaring. "So there is a reason." She nodded, slow and heavy. "Katsuki is the once and future king. He is the one who will unite the land." Izuku stared forward dumbly. "Him? But he faces many threats from friend and foe alike." "I'm truly sorry, ma'am, but I don't see what this has to do with me," he admitted. "Everything. Without you, Katsuki will never succeed." Her tail whipped through the air behind her. His laugh was hollow, disbelieving. "No. No, you've got this wrong. There's no right or wrong. Only what is and what isn't." "I'm serious," Izuku said, flustered, angry, and overwhelmed. "I help people. I want to do good, but him? There's no way somebody like him wants to be a hero." The dragon only laughed, knowingly. "Perhaps it is your destiny to change that." She spread her wings, and only then did he see the iron chain fastened around her hind leg. She took off, and the chain clinked, dragging against the stone. "Wait, don't go. I need to know more." Izuku shouted, stumbling forward. But she was already gone. Only the chain's distant echo remained. He made his way back up every staircase, and through every hallway, alone this time, and even more exhausted. His thoughts were too tangled to organize, especially with this little sleep. It took him twice as long to get back without the pull of magic to guide him. By the time he reached his room, the sky outside had already begun to lighten. He slid into bed, not bothering to take any of his clothes off besides his shoes. He was too overwhelmed by everything to care. His life had been flipped on its head, and all in a month. Dragons are real, and one knew his name. And unfortunately, she knew Katsuki's too. Izuku's eyes didn't shut until the birds started singing. Magic was something in his bones and in his blood, but now it felt like something else entirely. It was like something watching him. And after the dragon, Izuku couldn't shake the sinking feeling that his life had already stopped being his own. Izuku had learned quickly that the castle woke long before the sun fully did. He was up bright and early, potion in hand, making his way through the castle's intricate halls. Morning light leaked through the tall, arched windows surrounding him, catching on stone pillars and polished floors. Servants passed him in quiet streams, some carrying linens, others trays or ledgers, each of them intent on their own respective duties. None paid him much mind, and he was grateful for that. At least some of his peace could be maintained. Izuku followed the mental path Toshinori had given him, repeating the directions in his head repetitively. Left at the dragon tapestry. Take a right, another right, then a left. Go straight down the narrow hall. Third door on the right. Easy enough. He slowed when he reached the door, pausing just long enough to steady himself. The room felt right. The location matched. Everything lined up. He was confident that this was the right spot. He was right, but it was a right place, wrong time sort of ordeal. He stepped into the room through the already ajar door, but immediately froze. A blonde girl stood at the vanity with her back to him, haphazardly gathering her hair into two uneven buns. The room smelled faintly of soap and perfume. The bed and carpet were covered with deep purples, pinks, and yellows. The color scheme was extremely chaotic but intentional. Taking everything in, Izuku realized with sudden horror that he had walked into someone's private chambers unannounced. He blinked and opened his mouth to announce himself, anything to absolve him of the current awkward situation. You know, I've been thinking about Katsuki. Without turning, she spoke casually to him as if he were a friend. She moved behind a changing screen without sparing him a glance, interrupting Izuku before he could even start. His mouth clamped shut. What was he supposed to do? Pass me that dress, will you, Yura? She called. Izuku panicked, looking around until he spotted a royal blue dress draped across a chair. He picked it up carefully and placed it over the top of the changing screen, hoping that it was the right one. The blonde girl continued talking, blissfully unaware. I mean, he's a total JRK sometimes. Just because I'm the king's ward doesn't mean I have to accompany him to the feast, right? Izuku squeaked out the most unconvincing, high-pitched imaginable. He sounded like a dying mouse. God gave him a second chance to redeem himself. She hadn't heard him. Well, does it? She pressed. He shook his head instinctively, before realizing that the action was useless, and repeating, this time sounding somehow worse. If he wants me to go to the banquet, then he should invite me, she huffed. Izuku inched slowly backwards toward the door. And he hasn't. He took a careful step toward the exit, trying to quietly place the potion on the table without making eye contact with anyone or anything. So do you know what that means? He forced out another strangled, voice cracking in the worst possible way. The rustling behind the screen stopped. Where are you? Izuku's soul just about left his body. He squeezed his eyes shut and prayed to every god, dragon, and magical force in existence. Then, in the worst Uraraka impression to ever exist, he squeaked, "Here." It was terrible, but somehow, she didn't question it. It means I'm going by myself, she finished, sounding very pleased with herself. I need help with this fastening, she called. He stopped in his tracks. Uraraka? He spun in place, desperately searching for a solution that didn't exist. Then a familiar voice came from behind him. I'm here, Himiko. The real Uraraka stepped inside, eyebrows raised questioningly at him. Izuku could only sag with relief. She looked from him to the changing screen, then back to him. He mouthed the best explanation he could muster with dramatic hand movements over the next minute. She covered her mouth with her hand, shaking with silent laughter. Izuku groaned quietly at the end of his story, face-palming, before he shoved the potion into her hands. He mouthed a desperate thank you, before turning on his heel and fleeing the room desperately. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Toshinori brought Izuku to the banquet as his assistant, guiding him through the grand doors and into the heart of the castle's dining hall. Izuku felt strange the moment he stepped inside. Without his usual brown jacket and satchel, he felt exposed, almost unfinished. The white tunic and green vest he'd been dressed in were clean and proper, but the colors were too bright, making it harder for him to blend into the background than he'd like. Tonight, he felt like he stood out as an outcast no matter where he positioned himself. He considered himself somewhat of an ambivert, not minding being around crowds, though lacking in the social department, depending on the crowd. He took his place beside Tashinori near the edge of the hall, careful to keep his hands folded and his posture proper. The room was alive with sound, filled with loud conversations, laughter, and the clink of goblets. Nobles moved in small clusters beneath the glow of chandeliers and wall-mounted candles, their clothes heavy with embroidery and expensive cloth. Expensive jewelry caught the light whenever someone turned, and Izuku couldn't help but feel out of place amongst so much polish and wealth. Tashinori leaned slightly toward him, voice low enough that only Izuku could hear. "Remember, young Midoriya," he warned, "you're here to work." Izuku nodded, though his attention had already drifted. His gaze found Katsuki without any effort at all. The prince wasn't wearing his armor tonight. Instead, he wore in a fitted black tunic, the fabric hugging his frame in a way that made him look more human and more composed. A dark red cape rested across his shoulders, pinned neatly in place. Without his usual steel and leather, he looked less like a fighter and more princely. He no longer blended in with the other knights, gathered at one side of the room. Instead, he belonged in the center of it. Katsuki was speaking with the king's ward near one of the long tables. Izuku noticed right away that she hadn't worn the blue dress from earlier. Instead, she was dressed in red, the fabric cut to leave her arms uncovered and the back of the gown open. It was formal and clearly chosen with intention, standing out among the darker colors worn by others nearby. Izuku had to admit she looked beautiful. She stood straight as she listened, responding easily, accustomed to attention and conversation in settings like this. Katsuki faced her, posture rigid even without armor. Their conversation looked ordinary enough, two people speaking amid the noise of the hall, yet they were impossible to miss under the candlelight. "She looks great, doesn't she?" Uraraka sighed, suddenly beside him. Izuku didn't turn. "Yeah. What about Arthur?" "He looks fine," she replied flatly. Izuku gave her a small grin. "I thought you liked the rough-tough, save-the-world kind of men." She rolled her eyes. "No. I like much more ordinary men. Like you." Izuku laughed, amused by the comment. "Uraraka, believe me, I'm not ordinary." She blinked, processing, before waving her arms in the air. "No, I didn't mean you, obviously. Just, well, I meant, men like you." They both paused. The awkward tension in the air was palpable. "Well, thanks," Izuku muttered, scratching the back of his neck. They both looked away at the same time. Thankfully, the king interrupted the moment. King Zen rose from his chair at the head of the great dining table. The scrape of wood against stone carried and cut through the noise of conversation. One by one, all voices fell silent. All eyes turned to the white-haired man. "We have enjoyed 20 years of peace and prosperity," the king said, his voice bellowing easily through the hall. Izuku felt his shoulders tense. He knew exactly what the king was referring to, and what that peace meant to him. He was speaking of the erasure of magic, a common talking point of his. Something uneasy stirred beneath Izuku's skin at the mention. "It has brought the kingdom many pleasures," Zen continued, "but few compare to the honor of introducing Lady Nemuri, known to many of you as Lady Midnight." Applause filled the hall as the tall woman Izuku recognized from before stepped onto a platform opposite of the king's table. Her dress was white around the shoulders and bust, but cut to black below that. It was intricately lined at the waist with small red crystals that caught the candlelight. Two candelabras flanked her, while the chandelier above scattered light across her figure, making the fabric shimmer with each movement. As the clapping faded, a harpist seated to the side began to play. When Lady Nemuri sung, the room seemed to hold its breath. It was undeniable that she deserved the recognition she received for her ability. Izuku didn't understand the language she was singing in, but it unsettled him all the same. It felt oddly familiar, but he couldn't quite pinpoint it. The opera song unfolded slowly, mournful in tone, the melody soft and heavy, like a lullaby. Around him, people began to sag in their seats. A noble's head tipped forward onto folded arms. A goblet slipped from slack fingers and rolled across the floor without anyone reacting. Even the harp fell silent. Though, the singing continued. Izuku looked around to see Tashinori's shoulders slumped, his posture folding inward as if the weight of exhaustion had dropped onto him all at once. At first, Izuku wondered if this was somehow all simply due to the music. Then the feeling reached him too. It was no longer coincidental. This was undoubtedly magic. The tiredness crept in through his ears, dull and persistent, clamping down on his thoughts. His vision blurred at the edges before instinct took over. He pressed his hands over the sides of his head and stepped backward into the shadow cast by a stone pillar. By then, everybody lay sleeping besides Izuku and the singing woman at the end of the room. Lady Nemuri stepped down from the platform, her voice never faltering. As she walked, the candle flames flickered and went out one by one. Warm gold light drained from the hall, replaced by a pale, cold blue. Thin strands of cobwebs began to form across windows, crawling over furniture, clinging to sleeping forms like frost. The music swelled into a crescendo. In one smooth motion, Lady Nemuri drew a dagger from her sleeve. Her expression twisted, grief and fury cutting deep lines across her face as she pulled her arm back, preparing to throw. Izuku's gaze darted around the room, eventually landing on the chandelier almost directly above her. For a split second his irises flashed gold. The chain snapped. The chandelier tore free from the ceiling and crashed down with a deafening crack, like a bout of thunder. The stone beneath Izuku's feet shook with its wrath. The impact crushed the woman's legs beneath it, cutting her song short with a sharp, agonized scream. The spell broke immediately once her singing halted. People slowly awoke in confusion, coughing and gasping as they tore cobwebs from their clothes and skin. Chairs scraped back and voices rose in panic. Izuku looked back toward the fallen chandelier and froze. The woman trapped beneath it was no longer Lady Nemuri. It was the old woman from before. The same one from the execution who sought revenge for her son. It hit him. She was the same woman he previously saw in the mirror. It all clicked so suddenly. He didn't know how it didn't make sense sooner. Blood stained her sleeve as she dragged herself upright, eyes locked on the prince. With a hoarse cry, she hurled the dagger. An eye for an eye, Zen. Katsuki, still dazed from slumber, didn't move in time. Izuku did. He sprinted across the marble floor, seized Katsuki by the front of his tunic, and hurled them both down to the tile just as the dagger embedded itself into the back of Katsuki's chair with a violent crack. For one breathless moment, the hall was silent. "Kill her," the king roared. Izuku looked away this time, not wanting to bear witness to another death. He heard her scream. He heard the gurgling wetness bubbling from her lungs. His stomach twisted. When he opened his eyes, the king was standing in front of him. He practically jumped out of his skin when he realized the man was looking right at him with pale eyes. "You saved my son's life. A debt must be repaid." He spoke casually as if he didn't just watch such violence. Izuku looked to Katsuki, who was staring at him with an unreadable expression. Well, Izuku clasped his hands behind his back. "Don't be so modest," the king cut him off. "You shall be rewarded." "No, honestly, you don't have to, Your Honor," he smiled. "No, I insist. This merits something quite special. You shall be awarded a position in the royal household." Izuku's tongue felt thick in his mouth. He didn't want to work for the king, the same man who had killed many just like him. His thoughts were interrupted abruptly. "You will be Prince Katsuki's manservant." And with that, the king gave a quick nod and walked off before Izuku could respond, utterly dumbfounded. This had to be some sort of sick joke. Katsuki's expression changed in an instant to horror and disbelief, looking between Izuku and the back of his father's head. Their eyes met, both astonished. Katsuki looked away quickly, scoffing under his breath. Izuku saved the prince's life, and as a reward, was forced to serve him. This was just great. He fought the urge to try kicking himself awake from this nightmare. He knew it had to be a reality though, because his mind wasn't sick enough to come up with this kind of torture. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Izuku sat at the small wooden table Toshinori had dragged into his room earlier that week. It still smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. A single candle burned at its edge, its flame weak and low, fighting for breath. He watched the wax pooled at its base grow with slow drips, the orange light painting shadows across his tired face. His door squealed open, causing Izuku to jump in his seat. Toshinori failed to knock yet again. "I told you about the knocking thing," Izuku muttered, though there was no real bite to it. Toshinori didn't seem to care though, and he stepped inside anyway. "Seems you're a hero now," he chuckled. Izuku smiled, but it was small and tired. "Hard to believe, isn't it?" "No," Toshinori replied. "I knew it from the moment I met you." Izuku didn't know how to respond to that. His eyes drifted back to the candle. The flame had shrunk further, flickering like it might give out any second. "Still," he said quietly, "I used magic. I shouldn't have done that." Toshinori stepped farther into the room. "I disagree, young Midoriya." He shook his head. "It seems we have finally found a use for your gifts. I saw how you saved the prince's life. Perhaps that's its purpose." Izuku leaned back in his chair, shoulders slumping as he stared at the faint, trembling light. "My destiny," he said, flat and unenthused. The candle sputtered like it shared the same thought. But Toshinori didn't hear the disappointment or sarcasm behind it. "Indeed," he replied proudly. Just then, a sharp knock echoed from the front door, far too loud for the small place. "Izuku Midoriya," a voice called through the wooden barrier. "Prince Katsuki requests you right away." Izuku didn't move. The candle finally let out one last flicker, then dimmed into a thin trail of smoke. Toshinori glanced at the door, then back to Izuku, his lips quirking into a grin. "Well," he said, stepping back, "your destiny's calling. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator." A few weeks had passed since Izuku Midoriya had been assigned as Prince Katsuki's manservant, though the title felt misleading at best. Manservant implied chores and cleaning. What it actually meant, more often than not, was being dragged into early mornings, late afternoons, and whatever spare moment Katsuki could carve out for training. It meant shoveling Katsuki's trusty horse's manure and bearing the weight of random weapons he was forced to lug around. On most days, Izuku felt less like an attendant and more like a convenient target. The prince was relentless in everything he did. He demanded constant attention, constant readiness, and constant improvement, whether Izuku wanted to give it or not. If something wasn't done perfectly, it was done again. And again. And again until he was satisfied. Though Katsuki was hardly ever satisfied. He never seemed to tire of pointing out flaws, nor did he accept excuses. Izuku had heard that all of his previous servants abruptly quit or were immediately fired. No wonder. That was how Izuku found himself standing in the empty training field behind the castle, armor strapped too loosely across his shoulders. The grounds were quiet at this hour, the grass flattened and scarred from countless drills. Beyond the trees, the faint sounds of the barracks carried on the wind. Here, though, it was just the two of them. Katsuki stood a short distance away, posture loose and ready, as if he had been born on a training field. Izuku shifted his weight, already bracing himself. He was drowning in armor. That was the only way to describe it. The breastplate hung too heavy, his shield dragged at his arm like dead weight, and the sword, well, the sword didn't want to go back in its sheath, no matter how aggressively he tried. He puffed his cheeks, fumbling with it. Katsuki watched him struggle and rolled his eyes, turning away and swirling his sword through the air with experience. "Ready?" Izuku stared at him. "Would it make any difference if I said no?" "Not really." Katsuki didn't even pretend to be sympathetic. Izuku sighed, pulled his helmet over his head, and braced his shield close, hoping he could just disappear behind it. Katsuki stepped in easily, swinging his sword like it was an extension of his arm. "Body," he called, and tapped Izuku's side with the blunted edge. "Shield." A clang against Izuku's shield. The pattern repeated itself. "Body. Shield. Body. Shield." Izuku tried to keep up, but he stumbled backwards with every strike, armor clanking as he tripped over his own feet. He wasn't weak, but he was completely new to the sport, and struggling because of it. Then Katsuki suddenly changed the previous pattern. "Head." Izuku blinked. "Head." Clang. The flat of Katsuki's practice sword smacked the top of Izuku's helmet, causing it to ring out inside of the piece of armor. Izuku yelped, stumbling back. Katsuki let out an irritated groan, lightly bouncing on his feet. Come on, Deku, you're not even trying. He'd slapped that nickname on him within the first week. Izuku had tried, once, very briefly, to protest. That attempt had earned him extra drills, a buttload of extra work, and a splitting headache. So, the name stuck. Katsuki, of course, hadn't escaped unscathed either. Izuku had given him a nickname of his own in a moment of exhausted honesty, pointing out that for someone so loud and demanding, the prince was strangely needy, constantly hovering, and refusing to leave Izuku alone for more than 5 minutes at a time. He'd said Katsuki reminded him of a baby because of it. He poked fun with a name that sounded childish to him. Kaken. Katsuki had nearly taken his head off for it, shouting until Izuku's ears pulsed, swearing that if Izuku ever said it again, he'd either regret it for the rest of his life or no longer have one. That didn't stop him. He said the name every day in place of the proper way to address the prince. Izuku never ceased to astound Katsuki with his disregard for his status. Izuku, now out of his thoughts, watched Katsuki raise his sword again, advancing with ease. Izuku scrambled, barely blocking, tripping over his own boots. All right, Katsuki said, sounding impatient. Was more. Oh God. Izuku groaned. This time Katsuki gave more space between directions. To the left. Izuku blocked it, though it was a close call. Right. He jerked his shield up just in time. Head. Oh no. Bang. The helmet rang once more with the hit, vibrating Izuku's skull. Katsuki rounded on him again, and Izuku scrambled back, clutching his aching head. Kaken, I swear to God, I have a brain in here. Then start using it. Katsuki barked. I've got a tournament to win. Can we stop now, please? Izuku panted, his sword and shield drooping at his sides. Katsuki didn't answer. Instead, he stopped calling out instructions altogether and just attacked. There was a blur of strikes. Izuku was just a training dummy at this point, failing to defend whatsoever. And of course, to end it all off. What? Right on the head. This time, Izuku toppled backward into the grass, helmet flying off with the impact and rolling away. He lay there, dazed, staring up at the sky. Katsuki stood over him, sword resting on his shoulder. You're braver than you look. Most servants give up after the first blow. Is it over? Izuku asked weakly. That was just the warm-up. Katsuki tossed the sword aside, reaching for another weapon. How's your mace work coming along? It was a rhetorical question. The first time they fought each other in the market with the familiar spiked ball and chain weapon showed that Izuku had zero ability to fight with that thing. So Izuku didn't answer. He just laid back in the grass, staring at the clouds, accepting his fate. It was going to be a very long day. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Izuku stood in the corner of the armory, covered in metal. Uraraka circled him, examining the armor he was adorned with. So, she said, adjusting the strap on his arm, you've got the closers on the biceps. Tight enough to stay, loose enough to breathe. Her hand pressed lightly over his upper arm. Izuku gave a thoughtful hum, pretending he didn't feel awkward where he stood, and it didn't help how natural she was with all this, majorly outdoing him. He looked like a mess in comparison. She stepped closer, tapping over the breastplate. The forget goes here, chest and neck. She knocked her knuckles against the armor by his collarbone, and it thunked dully. Chest. Right. He repeated it under his breath, like maybe if he said it enough times it would stick. And the helmet. Uraraka raised a brow, smirking. I assume you at least know where that goes? Izuku took it from her gently, sliding it onto his head. It sat half crooked, sliding down over his eyebrows and flattening his hair to his forehead, getting in his eyes. He pushed his bangs back through the visor slit, unimpressed. How come you're so much better at this than me? Uraraka snorted, adjusting one of his shoulder plates. Well, cut yourself some slack, Aizu. I'm literally the blacksmith's daughter. I've known how to clean the crevices of pauldrons since I was 6. I know pretty much everything there is to know about armor, which is actually kinda sad when you think about it. She gave a breathy laugh, rubbing the back of her neck. No, it's not sad, Izuku said immediately, shaking her shoulder gently to get her to look at him. It's really cool. I mean, what would I do without you? She tried to hold her serious face, but she couldn't help smiling. Katsuki would probably murder you publicly if you messed up his armor. Izuku nodded solemnly. He probably still will if I'm being completely honest. He tugged the helmet back off, raking a hand through his hair to reshape it. That may be true knowing him, she grimaced, imagining it. Good luck then, I guess. She laughed it off. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Izuku fumbled with the armor on Katsuki's forearm. His fingers were clumsy, failing to be dexterous, and too aware of the prince's growing impatience. Katsuki looked about one mistake away from an outburst. You do realize the tournament starts today, right? Katsuki muttered through gritted teeth. Izuku winced, still messing with the piece of armor, racking his brain for what Uraraka taught him about it. Yes, unfortunately. Katsuki rolled his shoulders with a frustrated exhale, muscles tense beneath the polished armor. Izuku watched, curious. Are you nervous? I don't get nervous. Katsuki's eye twitched. Really? I thought you dash. Will you shut up? Katsuki snapped. Yep, definitely nervous. Izuku took the hint and got his hands moving, tightening the last buckle before backing away. He reached for Katsuki's cape, and he carefully draped it around the prince's shoulders. The fabric fell perfectly, the golden clasp catching the light as Izuku locked it into place. He handed over the helmet with a relieved smile. Yeah, I think you're all set. Katsuki didn't move, jaw clenching. Aren't you forgetting something? Izuku opened his mouth to respond, then shut it after realizing he didn't know what it was. He put a finger to his lips in thought. The prince cut off his train of thought. My sword, you idiot. Oh, right. Katsuki looked like he might commit homicide then and there. Izuku only awkwardly smiled before scurrying to the weapon stand. He grabbed the prince's sheathed sword and barely got his hand off it before Katsuki snatched it away and stormed off toward the arena grounds. Izuku watched him go, exhaling with blown cheeks. That went well, he whispered to himself. But hey, it could have gone worse. A certain green-haired servant could have been publicly executed like Uraraka hypothesized. He shrugged, shaking his head, and turned to follow Katsuki at a safe distance. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. The stands trembled with noise. Suddenly, a line of drums started to thunder, encouraging the noise of the rows and rows of spectators that filled the arena. From behind the gates, two long single-file lines of knights emerged, some waving to the crowd, confidently. Others walked stiffly and silent, gripping their helmets like lifelines. Katsuki was an in-between. He was neither pompous nor shaking. All of them stopped in the center of the arena, turning to face the king where he stood in front of them. The crowd hushed. The king paced slowly before them, his voice deep and ringing across the arena. Knights of the realm, it is a great honor to welcome you to this year's tournament here in Nizudafu. Over the next 3 days, your strength, your courage, your very title as warriors will be put to the test. And of course, you will be given a chance to dethrone the reigning champion, my son. He paused, and every eye turned to the blonde before his name was even spoken. Prince Katsuki. A hushed whisper floated over the crowd at the mention of the young royal. Izuku had learned that the rumors about him ranged from unrealistic romantic fantasies to stories making him out to be some sort of deranged monster who killed for sport. Though none of the people truly knew him. Izuku didn't know that anybody did. Only one can have the honor of being crowned champion, and he will receive a prize of 1,000 gold pieces, the king continued. Izuku noticed that this statement elicited a few greedy smiles from the knights below. It was obvious why most of them were here. It is in combat that we see a knight's true nature. The king paced before the rows of knights. Whether he is a warrior or a coward. There was a pause before he raised his fist into the air. The tournament begins. The arena exploded with cheers. The knights bowed in unison, even Katsuki, though his movements looked weirdly out of character. And now that Izuku could really see his face, he immediately noticed that something was off. His face was blank, but not in his usual way. He didn't appear bored, annoyed, or smug, the emotions he expressed most around Izuku. He was almost entirely unreadable. Izuku didn't know what that meant, but it bothered him. He knew he shouldn't care, but it didn't stop the sinking worry he felt for the prince. The first match was already being called, and knights began filing off the arena floor. Katsuki stayed behind. King Zen approached him briefly, leaning in to whisper something in his ear. Katsuki's expression didn't change. The only reaction he gave was a small twitch of his nose scrunching before his father clapped him on the shoulder and walked away toward the royal box in the stands. Oh, so that's what it was. Then it was just Katsuki and his opponent. He shrugged off his red cape, tossed it aside, and slid his helmet on. The knight across from him mirrored his actions. Shields were handed to both of them. Then the cheering started again, louder now. Katsuki didn't wait. The moment the fight began, he was on the offensive. He displayed no showmanship or hesitation. His goal wasn't to impress the crowd. It was simply to win. His opponent blocked the first 2 strikes. The third nearly knocked him off his feet. By the fourth, he was scrambling to keep up. Izuku couldn't help it, so he yelled from the sidelines, "You've got this, Kakin." He wasn't alone. The entire left side of the arena had taken a liking to chanting the prince's name. After another flurry of strikes, Katsuki caught his opponent off balance for just a fraction of a second, but it was all he needed. After all, they were in very close quarters due to the current position. He slammed an elbow into the man's face, knocking him flat into the dirt. The crowd roared as dust kicked into the air. The matches continued. A knight with a yellow surcoat and a shield decorated with 3 snakes won his match with more technique than strength. Izuku didn't know much about sword fighting, but he could tell that something about the style felt dirty. The shields, crests, and expressions changed with every match, every victory claimed by someone new. Some knights were small but brutal, some were large but light on their feet. It was a true range of diversity amongst fighting styles. Eventually, the first set of matches ended. There was a small break before the second started. Katsuki stood next to Izuku in the sidelines, watching carefully with his arms crossed. Izuku pointed toward the knight in yellow. "He looks pretty good with a sword." Katsuki didn't look away. "I guess." Coming from him, that was practically praise. Later, after Katsuki won yet another match, they returned to where Izuku had helped him armor up earlier. This time, Izuku helped him out of it, leaving just the chainmail and red surcoat underneath. The knight in yellow approached, still holding his shield. "May I offer congratulations on your victories today?" he said politely. "Likewise," Katsuki replied, forcibly sounding respectful but not enthusiastic. "I hope to see you at the reception later." The knight nodded and walked away. Once he was gone, Izuku muttered, "Creep." Katsuki snorted, smiling in a way that Izuku barely got to see. It made him feel strangely giddy and full of pride to be able to draw that out of the prince. It didn't take long for Katsuki's expression to sour. He clicked his tongue, "Something's off about that guy." He handed Izuku, who nodded, his helmet. "Oh, and Deku?" Izuku looked up, a little too hopeful. "Yeah. For tomorrow," Katsuki said, already walking away, "you need to repair my shield, wash my tunic, clean my boots, sharpen my sword, and, polish my chainmail." There was. Izuku stared after him, pursing his lips. "Right?" he muttered. "Of course." The happy moments were short-lived as always. Diamond operators, star operator, diamond operator. A wet tunic wrung itself out over a bucket in midair, droplets of water pattering like rain. A pair of leather boots floated near the foot of the bed, slowly turning in place while a bristle brush scrubbed away layers of dust and dirt. Katsuki's sword was suspended horizontally, glinting in the candlelight as a sharpening stone slid back and forth along its edge in steady rhythm. A helmet rotated lazily in the air, being polished by a square of cloth. Everything in the room was moving, well, except Izuku. He was curled up in bed with a blanket around his shoulders, his nose buried in his grim more like there weren't objects currently floating around his room. He squinted at a rune labeled Efficiency Charm, mumbling to himself, "Interesting, okay." He adjusted the blanket, flipped to the next page, and casually flicked 2 fingers in the air. The sharpening stone sped up. He could get used to this. Suddenly, his door slammed open. All at once, every floating object dropped like a corpse. The boots thudded to the floor, the tunic splashed back into the bucket, the sword nearly took off Izuku's toes, and the helmet rolled across the floor like it was trying to escape. Izuku snapped upright in bed. In the doorway stood Toshinori, the disappointment already evident on his face. He didn't appear angry, just tired and resigned. "Are you Dash?" He looked around the room, then back at Izuku. "Seriously using magic again, young Midoriya?" Izuku lowered his book without meeting his eyes. "No. What is all this then?" Izuku glanced at the mess, shrugged, and attempted the world's most unconvincing innocent face. "It's laundry day?" It was not. In fact, laundry day. Toshinori pinched the bridge of his nose, muttering something that sounded like a prayer for patience. He sighed, long and heavy. "I was just going to tell you that supper is ready," he flatly stated. His gaze trailed over the room one more time before he quietly closed the door. The moment it clicked shut, Izuku let out a sigh of relief. He hugged the grimoire to his chest, smiling a little despite himself. "One day," he whispered to it, "you'll get me killed. But until then, you make my life way easier." He set it gently on his pillow, stretched, and stood. Dinner was his first priority. Then he'd clean the mess. Though, likely not by hand. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Katsuki paced in front of the long wooden table decorated with his armor, boots, folded laundry, and sword. He stopped, eyeing everything with suspicion, arms crossed over his chest as if he refused to believe what he was looking at. His brows were knit, irritation etched on his face, puzzled by the sight before him. "You did all this yourself?" "Yes, sire." Izuku stood stiffly beside the table, hands behind his back, fighting a smug smile he couldn't quite hide. Katsuki scowled as if he wanted his servant to fail. "Chances are he probably did. Whatever. Let's see if you can get me into it without screwing anything up." Izuku swallowed a retort and stepped forward, already pulling the chainmail toward him. He lifted it over Katsuki's head, the rings clinking together as it settled against his tunic. Next came the surcoat, Mizudafu's golden dragon crest stitched boldly across the chest. Izuku tugged the fabric straight, smoothing it down Katsuki's front as he thought to himself. Considering the history of it all, the crest of the kingdom being a dragon was quite ironic. Next was the armor. This was the part where Izuku normally fumbled. Each piece took its own unique sort of precision. But this time, Izuku didn't pause every few seconds to check his memory. His fingers moved with more confidence, guiding leather through buckles, securing Katsuki's pauldron, and fitting his vambraces snug against his forearms. When Izuku finished with the greaves and stepped back, Katsuki tugged at a few straps, rolled his shoulders, and tested the fit. After a long moment, he gave a slow nod. That wasn't bad. That was the equivalent of an enormous compliment to Izuku. Katsuki normally only showed disdain, so any form of positive acknowledgement meant 10 times more than it would coming from anyone else. Katsuki cleared his throat, covering for himself. Not that it could have gone any worse. "I'm a fast learner," Izuku answered, crossing his arms with a gentle, satisfied smile. "I hope for your sake that's true, Deku." Katsuki barely smiled, grabbed his sword, and made for the door. "We should probably go now," Izuku reminded him why they were even here. "Yeah, whatever." The prince took a steady breath, then left the room. Izuku fell in line behind him. They walked the halls in an unusual quiet, heading toward the arena. This time, the knights entered the arena one by one. With more than half of them already eliminated, the procession was shorter and heavier with anticipation. When Katsuki's name was announced, he stepped into the center of the arena and raised his sword high. The crowd answered immediately, cheers rolling through the stands. Izuku watched from the sidelines as he had before, Toshinori standing at his side. He glanced toward the royal box and saw the king smiling openly, pride written plainly across his face. Katsuki saw it too. If Izuku focused hard enough, he could see the faint curve of a smile being carefully held back. It was unusual seeing the prince so calm. His level of composure seemed to vary depending on his surroundings. And when he was with his servant, he definitely didn't censor himself much. Izuku didn't realize he was smiling until Toshinori nudged him lightly in the ribs. "Is it just my imagination?" Toshinori said, amused. "Or are you starting to enjoy yourself?" Toshinori had listened to Izuku complain about the prince for weeks, Katsuki's name on his lips as the blame every night when Izuku dragged himself home sore and exhausted. He couldn't blame the man for sounding hopeful. Well, Izuku hesitated, eyes still on the arena. "It's not completely awful. At least, not all the time." The horn sounded before Toshinori could respond. Katsuki's first match had begun. Izuku's attention snapped fully back to the field. Katsuki struck first, driving his sword into the opposing knight's shield with enough force to send the man stumbling backward. "Yes." Izuku clapped before he could stop himself. The match didn't last long. Katsuki pressed forward, relentlessly landing blow after practiced blow, and within moments the other knight was disarmed and forced to yield. His victory was clean and undeniable. Several more matches followed. Izuku watched them pass with only half an eye, trading quiet comments with Toshinori, his interest drifting until the knight in yellow from before stepped forward. This opponent was aggressive, fast, and clearly experienced. From the start, the yellow knight was pushed onto the defensive, retreating step by step until his back nearly touched the stone wall of the arena. It looked grim. Then, in a blink, the momentum shifted. Instead, the other knight was pressed back into the wall, shielding him from view. For a moment, all Izuku could see was the yellow knight's back. Then he stepped aside. The other knight lay crumpled against the wall, unmoving. The crowd erupted. The knight in yellow lifted his sword overhead, acknowledging the cheers. Izuku found himself staring at his shield instead. Every knight bore a crest or banner, something familiar or at least recognizable. This one showed 3 intertwined snakes. Izuku frowned. He didn't recognize it. He made a mental note to check the library later. His unease grew as he looked back at the fallen knight. "I think he might be badly hurt," Izuku said quietly, worry creeping into his voice. Toshinori followed his gaze and moved quickly. After a brief inspection, the knight was removed from the field and carried toward the physician's quarters. The day ended soon after. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Izuku took the stairs 2 at a time. The moment he pushed open the door, Katsuki's armor still bundled in his arms, he blurted, "How is he?" Toshinori looked troubled. "It's strange. Come here." Izuku dropped the armor in a very indelicate fashion and stepped closer as Toshinori indicated the knight's neck. "Too small. Puncture wounds stood out against pale skin." "It looks like a snake bite," Toshinori said. Izuku's brow furrowed. "But he was injured during a sword fight. How could a snake dash?" "His symptoms are consistent with poisoning," Toshinori interrupted. "Slow pulse, fever, and paralysis." "Can you heal him?" Izuku asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be simple. "If it's venom, I'll need an antidote," Toshinori said grimly. "And to make one, I need venom from the snake that bit him." Izuku slumped forward, arms wrapping around each other. "And if he doesn't get it?" Toshinori met his eyes. "Then there's nothing more I can do." The weight of that implication settled heavily in Izuku's chest. "Is it possible that he was bitten before the match?" Izuku asked slowly. "Possibly. It may be our best hypothesis for now." Izuku's thoughts raced. He was fighting that one knight who dash. He stopped short as it dawned on him. The unease he'd felt around the knight earlier might not have been purely coincidental. "What was that?" Toshinori asked, not hearing what the younger man had just muttered. Izuku shook his head. "Nothing. I'll be right back, Yagi." He turned and left before Toshinori could stop him, the door creaking shut behind him. "Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator." Izuku moved quickly through the castle corridors, urgency pushing him forward. The fastest route to the library cut straight through the wing reserved for the visiting knights, rooms provided by royal courtesy for those still competing in the tournament. The thought of running into the night he was going to the library to investigate unsettled him. By now, most of them would be returning from the tavern. He'd overheard a group earlier, laughing loudly, already planning to go just as Izuku had begun tending to Katsuki's armor after the day's matches. The only reason he was even going to the library was because something small had been bothering him. During the matches, he'd noticed the crests on the knights' shields, capes, and surcoats. He wasn't especially knowledgeable about them, but he'd picked up a few over time, enough to recognize most of what he'd seen. Except one. The shield with 3 snakes stood out to him, mostly because he didn't recognize it at all. He'd asked Katsuki about it earlier, half expecting the prince to brush him off. Katsuki had frowned, said he didn't know it either, then dismissed it as some minor house or distant family crest. There were plenty of those. That should have been the end of it. Still, Izuku couldn't quite shake the thought. Maybe it was nothing. Probably was. But he figured he might as well check, if only to put it out of his mind. Laughter drifted down the hallway ahead of him, snapping him out of his thoughts. Izuku slowed, then stopped altogether. The sound was coming from the corridor ahead, heading directly toward the knight's quarters. Of course, perfect timing. He moved without thinking, slipping behind a stone statue just before the hallways intersected. The knights passed moments later, voices overlapping, boots scuffing against the floor. Izuku held his breath as they walked by, keeping his body pressed close to the cold stone. He caught a glimpse of yellow fabric among them. Once their voices began to fade, Izuku eased out from hiding and followed at a careful distance. One by one, the knights peeled away, disappearing into their assigned rooms. Izuku slowed, watching closely, until the knight in yellow turned and slipped inside his chamber. When the corridor finally fell quiet, Izuku approached the door. He paused, scanning the hall in both directions to make sure the coast was clear. He leaned forward and pressed his eye to the keyhole. Inside, the knight stood with his back partially turned, holding something above his head with 2 fingers. Izuku readjusted himself, struggling to see clearly through the keyhole. Once the picture before him was clearer, he realized that the knight was holding a mouse by its tail. He crossed the room and stopped in front of his shield, which was propped against a low footstool. From this angle, Izuku could see it clearly, and his breath caught in his throat. The 3 snakes on the shield weren't painted anymore. They were moving. Their mouths opened, fangs glinting in the light. Izuku recoiled from the door in shock, heart hammering. He pushed forward and forced himself to look again. The knight dropped the mouse. All 3 snakes lunged, twisting over one another, tearing into it with frightening speed. Izuku swallowed hard, disgust twisting in his stomach. The mouse was gone within seconds. Suddenly, all 3 snake heads snapped toward the door at once. Izuku stumbled back in panic, crashing into an armored statue behind him. The clatter echoed down the hall. Sheet! Izuku bolted down the corridor and ducked around the same statue as before, pressing himself into the shadows. Behind him, a door opened. Footsteps followed slowly as if taunting him. The scrape of metal rang out as a sword dragged lazily along the stone floor. Izuku clamped a hand over his mouth, breathing shallowly, every muscle in his body rigid. The footsteps drew closer, then halted. His heart pounded so loudly in his ears, it felt like it might give him away. A few seconds passed. Then the footsteps turned, retreating back the way they'd come. Izuku waited until the sound faded completely before moving. When he was sure the corridor was clear, he took off at a full sprint, not stopping until he reached the physician's quarters. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Yagi! Izuku burst through the door with urgency. It slammed against the wall with a deafening crack. Tashinori startled, rising from his chair before he even had time to register who it was. By the time he opened his mouth, Izuku was already pacing in front of him, words tumbling over one another. The knight in yellow, his shield, Izuku said quickly. The snakes on it. They moved. I saw them. He's using magic. There's no other explanation and dash. Slow down, young Midoriya, Tashinori said, lifting a hand. Take a breath. Are you absolutely certain of what you saw? Izuku stopped pacing just long enough to look at him. Yes. I watched him feed them. I was looking through the keyhole and I saw it happen. I swear it's true. Toshinori studied his face for a moment, then nodded. It's okay. I believe you. Go on. Izuku turned and gestured toward the cot in the center of the room. The unconscious knight lay motionless, his skin deathly pale. He fought the knight in yellow earlier right before he collapsed. One of the snakes must have bitten him. That's how he was poisoned. The realization hit him all at once. Katsuki was still in this tournament. Izuku's stomach dropped. I need to go warn Kaken, he said, already turning and jolting toward the door. Wait, Toshinori said firmly. Izuku froze, his hand already on the handle. My boy, Toshinori continued, more carefully now, is there any chance you could be mistaken? Izuku stared at him. I know magic when I see it, he said, quiet but certain. I don't doubt that, Toshinori replied. But knowing and proving are two very different things. Do you have any evidence? Izuku hesitated. Don't you believe me? Of course I do, Toshinori spoke without pause. But I fear that you'll land yourself in trouble. How will you explain how you were in this knight's chambers? Well, I wasn't actually in his room, just looking in. Toshinori exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. Izuku flushed, realizing the ridiculousness of his statement. Does it really matter though? He reminded himself of the stakes here. He could kill someone. You can't go accusing someone of magic without proof. Toshinori's tone turned stern. That is especially so because the king would never trust the word of a servant over a knight. So what I say just doesn't count for anything? Izuku muttered, his frustration slipping into his voice, though it wasn't aimed at Toshinori. I'm afraid it counts for very little as far as the king is concerned. I wish it weren't true, but this is the way it is. Izuku looked to the injured knight again, fidgeting as he weighed his options. Finally, he let out a frustrated breath and shook his head. Without another word, he turned and left the room, shoulders tense with what was to come. He wanted to resign like his mentor, but the feelings inside of him wouldn't leave him so easily. Diamond operators, star operator, diamond operator. Izuku stood shoulder to shoulder with Katsuki outside of the arena, where all the knights would ready themselves. Both of their eyes were fixed on the knight 10 or so yards away from them. The man was enormous. He looked as if he was stretching his armor, his arms and shoulders especially thick with muscle. He wore a grin that never faltered in the arena, even as he drove blow after blow into his opponent. There was nothing careful about the way he fought. He relied on his brute force, confidence, and the clear expectation that whoever stood in front of him would fall. It seemed to be accurate, however, as all of the knights remaining were very skilled, including him. You're telling me you have to fight that? Yeah, Katsuki replied casually. Izuku tore his gaze away long enough to look at him. That's it? Aren't you scared? He's huge. Katsuki didn't look impressed. I've got this guy pegged, he chided. He's strong as hell and hits hard, but his stamina esigas. He gets slow when you wear him out. And you're fast. That was one of Katsuki's skills. He was always quick on his feet. Exactly. A cocky smirk tugged on the corners of his lips. Izuku nodded, still watching the knight out of the corner of his eye. What's his name again? Go-To Amasuji. And the knight in yellow? Izuku asked hesitantly. Nito Minoma, he sneered. Katsuki turned suddenly, snatching his helmet from Izuku with more force than necessary. Why? He said, glancing sideways at Izuku. You planning to take him out on a date or something? Katsuki was obviously joking, though it still caused heat to crawl up Izuku's neck. Izuku squawked. What no? Katsuki barked a laugh. Geez, relax, Deku. I was screwing with you. Katsuki pulled the helmet over his head and started striding toward the arena. He turned to call over his shoulder, still walking, I know a florist who could get you some roses, though if you decide you're gonna be honest. He winked tauntingly. Ugh, Izuku muttered flusteredly, wiping his hands over his face as if trying to clean it of the blush he was now adorned with. Diamond operator, star operator, diamond operator. Izuku watched from the edge of the grounds outside of the arena as Minoma reached the weapons stand and took up his sword. The blonde tested its weight once, rolling his wrist before turning back toward the arena. In doing so, his gaze caught on Izuku. Izuku hadn't realized how openly he'd been staring until then. Monoma smiled. It was polite enough at first glance, the kind of expression that might pass in a crowd, but it didn't reach his eyes at all. Izuku tried to return it out of instinct, forcing his lips upward, but it ended up looking more like a grimace than a smile. Monoma held the look for a second longer than necessary. Then he turned away, walking off toward the arena, casting one last glance over his shoulder as if to make sure Izuku was still watching. He was. A hand landed on Izuku's shoulder suddenly, startling him hard enough that G physically jumped, immediately snapping his attention away from Monoma entirely. Tashinori stood beside him, raising an eyebrow at his skittishness. His hand dropped. "How are you getting on?" Tashinori didn't need to ask to know that the boy was a nervous wreck. The question might as well be rhetorical. Izuku frowned, arms folding loosely in front of him. "Just doing my job," he said. After a beat, he added resentfully, "and minding my own business. It's for the best, you know. Weren't you a hero, Yagi? You, of all people, should understand." Desperation could barely be heard in his tone. Tashinori didn't answer right away. His eyes glazed over with that look of forbearance that he often wore. "Things are different now. You know that this is a dangerous matter." "Yeah, I do," Izuku bit. When he heard his own voice, he quieted, though his resolve stayed firm. "It's dangerous for Katsuki. It's dangerous for the other knights. It's dangerous for the man in your quarters who will surely die if we do nothing." Tashinori's expression firmed. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." He shifted closer, placing his hand back on Izuku's shoulder. "It's too dangerous for you. You must be careful. I made a promise." His grip tightened slightly. "I need you to make one too. Please, promise me you won't do anything rash." Izuku stared at the ground between them. Slowly, he lifted his hand and rested it over Tashinori's. For a moment, neither of them moved. Izuku began, then stopped. After a long pause, he took Tashinori's hand and guided it away from his shoulder, pressing it to the man's chest, returning it gently. His voice was quiet, but sturdy. "I can't. I'm sorry." Before Tashinori could respond, Izuku turned and walked off, the sounds of the crowd growing louder as he headed toward the arena, and toward Katsuki's match, already about to begin. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Izuku stood in the same spot he had the day before, still not privy to an actual seat, not that he minded. Here, he wasn't crowded by others and he had a better view than even the front row. There he watched Katsuki do exactly what he'd said he would. He met Goto blow for blow, parrying cleanly and forcing the larger man to move with him across the arena. Step by step, Katsuki guided the fight, making the ground work in his favor. The distance between them shifted constantly as Katsuki circled, drawing the fight out, while the heavier knight followed, swinging with less and less precision. The more muscular of the two began to slow. Katsuki didn't. The prince had been pacing himself, staying defensive to maintain his stamina. His movements only increased in aggression as the fight went on. The unsettling grin he'd worn through most of the match slipped away as the realization of the prince's strategy hit him. Katsuki struck yet again, the blow knocking the other man off balance. The crowd reacted at once, gasps cutting through the arena. Katsuki surged forward, swinging his sword low toward Goto's ankles, forcing the other man to duck down to block the swing. That was exactly what Katsuki wanted. He leapt immediately, driving his shield into the man's face with a sharp crack. Goto hit the ground flat on his back, the impact sending up a small cloud of dust. By the time Goto tried to sit up, dazed and blinking slowly, Katsuki's sword was already pointed at his chest. There was a delay before the arena exploded with sound. Katsuki pulled off his helmet and turned toward the crowd, offering them a quick wave, not bothering to smile, before turning away and heading straight back toward Izuku. The corners of his lips tugged up as he jogged over. "See," Katsuki said, nudging him lightly with his shoulder. "Told you I had him pegged." "That was amazing, Kaken," Izuku said without thinking. The praise didn't mean much, because everyone was thinking it. Katsuki shoved his helmet into Izuku's hands. "Shut up," he snapped, not quite looking at him as he crossed his arms and turned away. Izuku was surprised by the sudden outburst. If he didn't know any better, he might have thought Katsuki was embarrassed. Diamond operators, star operators, star operator, diamond operator. Nito's match came next. Izuku kept his eyes peeled, scanning the arena for any sign of magic. For a moment, hope crept its way into his chest. Maybe Nito wouldn't use the snakes. Maybe Izuku had been wrong. Then, his opponent collapsed. The man was carried off the field unconscious, laid out on a stretcher while the crowd murmured. Izuku hadn't seen the magic happen. Not a flicker. He fought the urge to hit himself for it. How could he miss something like this? He swallowed hard and forced himself to move, following Toshinori and the knights escorting the injured man back toward the castle. Behind him, Katsuki's voice rang out across the grounds. "Deku, you idiot! Come back here!" He could picture the expression well enough, not bothering to look back and see it. He would bet money that a vein was popping out of his neck or forehead. Katsuki wanted his armor off, only for it to be put back on later. He could wait. Izuku ignored him. He would have to deal with a very angry Katsuki later. He'd probably pay for his actions with Katsuki deciding to hit him over the head, likely with the closest object to him. Though, right now, it didn't matter. This did. Diamond operators, star operator, diamond operator. Young Midoriya, about what I said yesterday. Toshinori hesitated, rubbing a hand over his face. The king wouldn't listen. Not to you and not to me. Izuku didn't respond right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the two knights lying unconscious on the cots before him. One's appearance was much worse than the other, though both of their skin looked clammy and white. Honestly, he blamed himself. He was the only one involved with magic other than the perpetrator himself. He was the one who could have done something more. "I should have he started, then stopped. But you were right." Izuku looked up suddenly, pulled from his thoughts. "What?" Toshinori met his eyes, expression set with resolve. "We can't let him get away with this." "But we don't have any proof." "Not yet," Toshinori agreed. "If we could cure even one of them, we'd have a knight as our witness." Izuku's thought for a moment, already seeing the flaws in the suggestion. "But the antidote that," Toshinori sighed, "is the problem." Izuku studied him for a moment, something about the shift in his motivation nagging at him. "I'm sorry, Yagi," he said slowly, "but what changed?" Toshinori smiled then, small and tired, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You." He gave a quiet huff of breath. "I don't know how to explain it, my boy. You remind me of who I used to be. And more than that, you give me hope for the future." Before Izuku could think better of it, he stood and wrapped his arms around the older man. Toshinori froze for a moment before returning the gesture, resting a hand between Izuku's shoulders. After a few seconds, Toshinori patted his back and pulled away, gripping his arms gently. "Now," he said, clearing his throat, "back to the matter at hand. Any ideas?" Izuku's brows knit together as he thought, thumb brushing against his lip. It was silent for a few moments before his eyes widened. Before Toshinori could ask, Izuku was already moving. "Midoriya!" Toshinori called after him. But he was already out the door. "Diamond operators, star operator, diamond operator. You truly think you stand a chance against my son?" The king asked, already reaching for the wine. He poured himself a generous measure, unbothered. "He's a formidable warrior, my lord," Nito replied, lifting his goblet. "I only hope to prove a worthy opponent." He took a sip without breaking eye contact. "You should consider staying in Mizudafu once the tournament ends," the king said around a mouthful of bread, tearing into it with little care. "I could use more knights like you." From the hallway just beyond the banquet doors, Izuku watched in secret. He could see the resemblance now between father and son. They shared the same careless confidence. Katsuki sat at the table, stabbing at his food with his fork. His jaw was clenched tight. Izuku might have simply attended instead of watching, hidden from the sidelines, but Katsuki was still furious over earlier. Izuku had more important things to worry about anyway. And yes, when he'd asked if he could go, he'd been promptly smacked over the head and attacked with a barrage of insults. "I would be honored, my lord," Nito said, bowing his head slightly. Katsuki rolled his eyes. Honestly, Izuku had stayed and watched longer than he had to. With Nito confirmed at the banquet, he moved. Izuku realized too late that he didn't know the castle as well as he thought he did. The place was massive, corridors branching into others until they all started to look the same. It all seemed to blur together, and it took longer than he'd planned to find the right hallway. By the time he arrived, the hall was empty. He might consider it his luck changing, though it wasn't surprising. All of the remaining knights would be at the banquet still. What was lucky, however, was that he remembered the correct door. He stepped up to it and grabbed the handle. It wouldn't turn. Never mind. He still hadn't lost his streak of bad luck. Izuku exhaled, his nerves eating at him. After getting lost, he wasn't sure how much time he had left. He pressed his palm flat against the textured wood, and rested his head against it as an attempt to ground himself. On Klus, he whispered the spell he'd memorized weeks ago from his grimoire. The sound of the ancient tongue on his lips made him sound like an entirely different person. The moment the magic spilled from him, his eyes glowed their familiar golden color, and the lock clicked satisfyingly. The feeling of his magic reignited under his skin gave him a small burst of euphoria and confidence, enough to push the door open, stepping inside cautiously. The room was dim, the curtains drawn. In the center of it, resting upon a chair, was the shield. Izuku paused, scanning the space before moving any farther in. He noticed a sword that had been left propped against the wall, which he promptly armed himself with. He held the weapon at the ready as he approached the shield, tapping it once experimentally with the blade. Nothing happened. He was interrupted by the sound of voices in the distance, muffled conversation echoing through the halls. The knights were already returning from the banquet. Though Izuku had used up most of his time getting lost, he hadn't expected them to be back this quickly. His anxiety flared, causing his skin to burn. He needed time he didn't have. Izuku turned sharply toward the door, half expecting Nito to be there, ready to swing. Instead, something else caught his attention. A shadow along the wall shifted. It stretched and warped, slithering languidly up the brick. Izuku turned just as the first snake lunged with a hiss. Without hesitance, he slashed the creature's head clean off with his sword. The two other snakes recoiled before merging back into the image on the shield. Izuku knelt to grab the snake's severed head off of the floor. He didn't dare look at it for long. He shoved it in his bag before checking the keyhole to make sure the coast was clear. Maybe his unlucky streak was finally over. He exited the room, out of breath and frantic. A few knights passed him, heading the opposite direction. At the end of the pack was the one and only Nito, who eyed him suspiciously. Izuku couldn't find the will to care. He only continued to force his feet up off of the ground he so desperately wanted to melt into. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. Toshinori had already meticulously extracted the venom from the snake Izuku had thrown down in front of the poor old man immediately upon his arrival. I'm going to start on the antidote. This will only be enough for one of them, however. I'm going to go tell Arthur, Izuku said. You're going to need this. Toshinori handed him a small, leather bag. Izuku took it and turned for the door. And young Midoriya, Izuku turned back around to face Toshinori. What you did was very brave, the older man smiled. Izuku smiled back. Thank you, Yagi. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. You. Katsuki barked out a laugh. You chopped its head off? He clearly didn't believe Izuku, who had, moments earlier, pulled the snake's head from the now empty leather bag still in his hand. Izuku rambled on, barely stopping to breathe. The two knights were bitten by the snakes from Nito's shield. You can talk to Toshinori. He'll show you the puncture wounds. They both have them. This is the only logical explanation. I'd hardly call it logical, Katsuki scoffed. The first knight was winning by a landslide, Izuku reasoned. Nito had to cheat. Nito wouldn't dare use magic in Yuzurifu, Katsuki snapped. Our laws are common knowledge, Deku. They were both close enough to his shield, Izuku insisted. Close enough that no one would notice, I don't like the guy, Katsuki said, turning away, but that doesn't mean he's cheating. Tashinori is already working on an antidote. When they wake up, they'll tell you what happened. Katsuki let out an irritated breath and dragged a hand through his hair. If you fight Nito, Izuku spoke more urgently now, he'll use magic. It's the only way he can beat you. Katsuki turned back, clearly unconvinced. Look at it. Izuku shoved the snake's head toward him. Katsuki recoiled on instinct, pushing Izuku away with a curse. What the hell dash? Have you ever seen a snake like this in Mizudafu? Izuku pressed. Because I doubt it. That gave Katsuki pause. He stepped closer and took the head from Izuku, turning it in his hand. His expression shifted as he looked it over. His brows furrowed and his tongue prodded the inside of his cheek. I know I'm just a servant, Izuku said quietly, and my word doesn't count for much. Katsuki glanced up at him. But I wouldn't lie to you, Kaken. Katsuki stared at him for a long moment. Swear to me that it's true. I swear, Izuku promised without hesitance. He nodded once. Then I believe you. The sincerity in his voice caught Izuku off guard. Katsuki turned and set the snake's head down on his desk, continuing to inspect it. Izuku smiled from the sidelines. Diamond operator, star operator, diamond operator. Izuku and Katsuki stood side by side in the throne room, close enough that Izuku could feel the tension radiating off of him. When Nito passed in front of them, Katsuki glanced over. Izuku met his eyes, and they shared a brief look of mutual understanding. The king walked down the aisle and stopped in front of his throne. Why have you summoned the court? He asked, his attention settling on Katsuki. I believe Nito Monoma is using magic to cheat in the tournament, Katsuki declared, his voice firm. Across the hall, Ochako stiffened. Beside her, the king's ward, Himiko, turned her. The two of them exchanged surprised looks. Ochako looked to Izuku and mouthed, What's going on? He waved her off. She pursed her lips, but nodded in understanding. The king turned toward Nito. What do you have to say to this? My lord, this is ridiculous, Nito replied. I've never used magic. He shifted his gaze toward Katsuki. Does your son have any evidence to support this outrageous accusation? The king looked back at Katsuki. Do you have evidence? I do. Katsuki motioned for Izuku to come forward. Izuku shuffled over to Katsuki's side. He reached into the small bag he still carried and pulled out the snake's head. A low murmur spread through the room. The king took it from Izuku and turned away, inspecting it closely. He handed the head back mere seconds after getting it, turning to Nito. Let me see the shield, the king ordered. Nito handed it over without hesitation. Be careful, father, Katsuki said, his hand hovering near the hilt of his sheathed sword. The king shot him a strange look but didn't comment. At that moment, Tashinori entered the room. He caught Izuku's eye and motioned him over. Katsuki leaned in close and murmured, We need our witness. Find out what's going on. Izuku nodded and hurried to Tashinori's side. As you can see, my lord, Nito said calmly, it's just an ordinary shield. He's not gonna let everybody see the snakes come alive, Katsuki shouted. Then how am I to know what you're saying is true? The king replied. I have a witness, Katsuki said. Knight Yosetsu Owaze was bitten by one of these snakes. The venom made him gravely ill. However, he was given an antidote. He'll confirm Nito is using magic. Where is this witness? He should be here. Katsuki turned, looking for Izuku. The room was almost completely silent. Izuku and Tashinori stood a short distance away, speaking in hushed tones. Katsuki frowned and walked over. Where is he? Katsuki demanded. Izuku looked up at him, pale. He hesitated, swallowing thickly before whispering, He's dead. I'm waiting, the king's voice boomed, echoing through the hall. What the hell happened? Katsuki yelled. He was stabbed while Tashinori was away. I don't know what happened, Izuku stuttered out. Katsuki stepped forward again, slower this time. The witness is dead. The king moved down a step from the throne. So you have no proof to support these allegations. Katsuki clasped his hands behind his back and looked straight ahead. Have you seen Nito use magic? No, Katsuki cleared his throat. But my servant fought one of the dash. Your servant? The king snapped. You accuse a knight on the word of a servant? I believe he's telling the truth. My lord, Nito interjected smoothly, am I really to be judged on hearsay from a servant? Izuku stepped forward without thinking. I've seen the snakes come alive and dash. How dare you interrupt? The king shouted. Guards, seize him. Izuku was grabbed by the biceps and dragged toward the door. Wait, Nito called. I wouldn't want him punished on my account. The king nodded and the guards released him. You see, the king said, looking at Katsuki. This is how a true knight behaves. With gallantry and honor. My lord, Nito continued, if your son made these allegations because he's afraid to fight me, I'll graciously accept his withdrawal. The king turned to Katsuki. Is this true? Do you wish to withdraw from the tournament? No. The king was quick to reply, then what am I to make of this? Katsuki's jaw tightened, his shoulders rigid. Izuku could very obviously tell from these mannerisms, he was fuming. Obviously, Katsuki repressed his anger. There's been a misunderstanding. I withdraw my allegation. Aren't you going to apologize? Nito asked tauntingly. The king looked at Katsuki expectantly. Katsuki shook his head. Well, the king pressed. I can't. Yes, you can, he snapped. Say it. Katsuki's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening. He forced the words out. I apologize. The moment the words left his mouth, Katsuki turned and shoved his way through the crowd toward the doors. Izuku was on his heels in seconds. Diamond operator, star operator, star operator, diamond operator. I believed you. I trusted you and you made me look like an idiot, Katsuki snarled. The door to Katsuki's room had barely shut behind them before the words were out. I know it didn't go exactly according to plan, Kaken, but dash. Do not call me that. Katsuki's voice cracked like a whip. And didn't go to plan? He let out a harsh laugh. He paced a few times, then turned sharply on Izuku, his face contorted with anger. My father and the entire royal court think I'm a coward. You humiliated me. But dash, Izuku started. He slammed his hand down against the table, hard enough to rattle the items atop it. Izuku flinched. This was the angriest he'd ever seen the prince. But surely he must be at least somewhat understanding of the situation. We can still expose Nito, Izuku said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. This isn't over. We just need more time dash. Get out. Katsuki didn't even look at him when he said it. I no longer require your services. You're sacking me? Izuku almost laughed in disbelief. I need a servant I can trust more than this. You can trust me. Izuku reached out to put a hand on Katsuki's shoulder. Katsuki grabbed his wrist harshly and pushed him back with it. Look where that got me. Get out. Izuku stood there a moment longer, rooted to the spot. His thoughts felt tangled, stuck on the same impossible point. He had been prophesied to protect this man. How could that simply end here? There had to be something he was missing. He wanted to stay and reason with the prince, but there was nothing more to say. Hesitantly, Izuku turned toward the door. He slipped out as quietly as he could, careful not to let it slam, though it still shut behind him with a dull finality. He should have felt relieved. He had never wanted the position to begin with. Instead, all that took its place was confusion and a hollow sense of dejection. It was over,